Laurian Bohemia had no magic, and battle aura rejected him too. One Eastern breathing lesson changed that in less than 15 minutes. His body belonged here, but the soul inside it came from Earth. That Earth knowledge had already transformed Greywood into an industrial power. Steam buses moved people, muskets pierced armor, and cannons threatened castles. His system supplied enormous silver every morning to fund the transformation. Laurian invested it in roads, factories, workers, weapons, and political leverage. When a southern count seized one craftsman, Laurian built a proxy war, long before the cultivation breakthrough or the Southern War. Greywood's mornings already sounded like a territory that had forgotten how to sleep. Hammers carried up from the workshop district before sunrise, while pale light caught the snow lines along the eastern peaks. Laurian sat behind his study desk when Sylvia reminded him that Serena had sent 2 foxskin women north nearly a week earlier. He had managed to forget them beneath construction reports, military schedules, and factory problems, which irritated him more than the delay itself. People placed under his responsibility did not stop needing decisions simply because his ledger was crowded. Laurian told Sylvia to bring the 2 women to his study after dinner, then turned toward the courtyard business already waiting outside. 5 veteran hunters stood on one side of the yard, all old enough to have spent decades surviving the eastern mountains. Their skin had been weathered by wind, their hands carried old knife scars, and their equipment was deliberately plain. Bows, short blades, water skins, flint, salt, and rope mattered more to them than decorative armor ever would. Across the courtyard waited 10 Iron Guard soldiers in gray-blue coats with crossbows, short swords, and tightly packed field gear. Pack mules stood behind them, breathing white mist into the cold morning air. Aiden held the front position, with the rigid patience of an officer, waiting for Laurian to stop explaining and start sending people somewhere. Laurian walked out with the map already open in his hands. A ruler fumbling through loose papers before an expedition inspired exactly the wrong kind of confidence. He pressed the map against a low wall and told everyone the mission was reconnaissance, not combat. No shortcut, pass, or discovery was valuable enough to justify losing experienced people merely to prove it existed. A survivor could explain what he saw, correct errors, and guide the next team. A corpse could only become an expensive story. Laurian traced the stream valleys with one finger and listed the information he wanted recorded. Future camps needed level ground, reliable water, nearby game, protection from wind, and enough space for carts or construction crews. Mountain passes had to be judged not only by distance, but by snow risk, rockfall, and whether a loaded caravan could actually survive them. The route was supposed to become infrastructure later. Every observation had to be useful to people who were not standing in the courtyard now. Aiden's soldiers would make a clear mark on the map every half day. At every fork, they would leave a visible flag or marker, so later teams did not waste hours deciding which path had already been checked. Laurian hated paying twice for the same uncertainty. A road forgotten after one expedition had to be rediscovered by the next, and rediscovery consumed food, wages, daylight, and patience. Aiden said he understood, and Laurian believed him, because the officer had rarely needed an order repeated. Then Laurian gave him the limit that mattered more than distance. The party had 10 days. On the 10th day, they would turn around regardless of how tempting the next ridge looked. If supplies became tight earlier, they would retreat earlier. Laurian made it explicit that the rule would not soften just because the unfinished route became interesting. A rule that disappeared at the first inconvenience was only a suggestion wearing a serious face. He turned next to the hunters and acknowledged something many nobles would have struggled to say in front of soldiers. Their judgment on animal signs, mountain weather, and seasonal routes outranked his. The eldest hunter had crossed the region for more than a decade and knew which path became traps under snow or heavy rain. Laurian expected Aiden to command the expedition, but he expected the soldiers to listen when the hunters warned that the mountain itself was changing. Then he named the reward before anyone took the first step. Each hunter would receive 10 silver coins after returning, plus flour and salted meat. Anyone who brought back information valuable beyond the basic map could earn more. The hunters reacted immediately, because 10 silver coins represented months of ordinary income for men, who usually survived from one uncertain trip to another. Laurian liked promising rewards early. A man who knew what success would buy spent the entire job imagining the result, instead of discovering afterward that someone considered him useful. That motivation also traveled home with him. A hunter returning richer than he left would tell neighbors exactly which lord had paid him fairly before the next evening ended. The expedition packed quickly and filed out through the eastern gate behind Aiden. Laurian remained there until the last mule disappeared around the road bend and the street swallowed the group from view. Sylvia fell into step beside him on the walk back toward the manor. She mentioned that the werewolves Serena had brought home were learning basic commands faster than their handlers expected. Laurian stored that information without opening another discussion yet. There was a different signal he needed to send through the household first. He told Sylvia to prepare the empty room beside his study for the 2 foxskin attendants. Anyone expected to serve near him should not be sleeping across town and wasting time simply reaching the manor. Sylvia asked what status the women should receive once they entered the household. They had arrived from the south as slaves, and every servant in the manor would notice whether Greywood copied the same treatment. Laurian answered by setting concrete terms instead of delivering a moral lecture. They would receive the same quality of room and board provided to Iron Guard personnel living under the manor roof. Each would receive 50 copper coins every month and 2 spare sets of clothing. The women had been sent north under chains, but Laurian had no intention of preserving that condition inside his house. His tone made it clear the question was settled permanently. Sylvia left to arrange the rooms, while Laurian finally returned to the technical report waiting inside his desk. Copper Hammer had delivered results from the newest flintlock barrel experiment the night before. The report was detailed enough that Laurian read it twice before making a decision. A steam-driven drill had successfully bored an iron rod to the required depth and basic roundness. That proved the manufacturing concept worked. The failure appeared in the rear half of the barrel, where heat buildup made the wall slightly uneven. Copper Hammer proposed mounting the drill on a heavier cast iron base to reduce vibration. He also wanted a narrow water line running beside the drilling rod so the cutting surface stayed cool during long boring operations. If both changes worked, he estimated 1 barrel could be finished in under 5 hours. Laurian cared about that number more than the elegance of the machine. A musket could be revolutionary in battle and still strategically useless if Greywood produced only a handful each month. Faster barrels meant more finished weapons, more standardized training, and a production line capable of replacing losses instead of treating every firearm like treasure. Laurian signed the materials request and marked the improvement as a priority project. He had barely set the quill down when Sylvia's footsteps returned outside the study. The foxskin women had arrived and were waiting in the sitting room. Laurian told her not to make them wait any longer than he already had. 2 figures sat beneath the archway when he entered, one slightly taller and one visibly younger. Both had pale brown hair, upright fox ears, and amber eyes that lifted toward him at the same moment. Late sunlight caught the fine hair along their arms and gave them a faint golden outline. Their matching coarse skirts looked recently issued, clean enough to make a first impression without pretending they came from comfort. Laurian introduced his expectations the same way he did with anyone joining an important part of his household. No stealing, no schemes, no betrayal. Work done well would be rewarded, and problems too difficult to solve alone should be brought to him or Sylvia rather than hidden. The women glanced at each other before bowing their heads together. Their comment was accented but understandable, and both addressed him using the word they had been taught for an owner, master. Laurian corrected it immediately. He did not want that title used inside his home. Lord Laurian would be enough. The taller foxskin looked confused for a moment, repeated the new form carefully, and accepted the change without arguing. Laurian considered that sufficient for a first meeting. Sylvia took them away to show the rooms, kitchen, work areas, and grounds. Laurian returned to his study because sentiment did not process factory reports for him. Once the door closed, he admitted privately that the younger foxskin was undeniably pretty. Then he buried the observation beneath the same mental floorboard, where every non-urgent distraction waited for a future that might never become convenient. He picked up the barrel report and read it again anyway, partly because concentrating on it proved he still could. By the time the candle had burned lower, the courtyard outside had gone quiet, and the new attendants had settled into the nearby wing. Their names became the first useful detail Laurian learned the next day. Ling was the older sister. Tang was the younger. Ling looked to be in her early 20s, with darker fur and a single white tuft at the tip of her tail. She moved through rooms as if every object automatically entered an internal inventory the moment she saw it. On the first day, she cleaned Laurian's bedroom and studied all the way down to the narrow cracks along the window frame. Most experienced stewards would have called that unnecessary effort. Laurian called it a useful tendency, as long as she did not start polishing the ink off his paperwork. Ling's comment improved quickly. Her pronunciation remained stiff for a while, but she could follow household conversations within days, and rarely needed the same instruction explained twice. Tong appeared several years younger and carried much less caution in her body language. Her ears, tail, and face announced her mood before she found words for it. Laurian found that transparency unexpectedly easy to trust. A person who struggled to hide embarrassment also had difficulty disguising ordinary mistakes by accident. Curiosity produced the first mistake almost immediately. Tang picked up a set of small brass weights on Laurian's desk, turned them in her hands, and dropped the entire collection onto the floor. Metal scattered loudly across the room. Tang dropped to her knees at once, gathering pieces with her ears pressed flat against her head. She looked less worried about the objects than about what she expected an owner to do afterward. Ling rushed in and began helping her, before noticing Laurian standing in the doorway. The older sister straightened immediately, apologized, and offered to make Tang stand in the corner as punishment. Laurian refused to turn a dropped tool into a household trial. He crouched, picked up the last two weights, and returned them to their box. They were tools, not religious relics. Nothing on the desk was too sacred to survive being touched by a person doing legitimate work. Tang only needed to ask before handling unfamiliar equipment next time. That would prevent the scare and keep something genuinely delicate from being damaged later. She nodded hard enough to make her ears twitch. Laurian sat down, opened the next folder, and asked whether either sister had eaten breakfast. Ling paused as if the question itself had violated her expectations of how nobles behaved. Butler Bao had already sent bread and pickled radish. The food was familiar, she said, and better than what they usually received in the South. Laurian acknowledged the answer and returned to his paperwork without forcing her to explain further. Comparison already told him enough about Southern households that owned servants rather than employed them. Grain deliveries, wage sheets, and a tannery request for another furnace were still waiting on the desk. Greywood's administration did not stop, because one human moment deserved attention. Over the next several days, Ling and Tang settled into routines so consistent Laurian could almost measure time by them. Ling took control of the mornings. Hot water appeared before he fully woke, clothes were folded in the same place, and stationery returned to order before the first meeting began. She noticed a habit Laurian had never mentioned to anyone. He always placed his quill on the right side of the holder rather than the left. After seeing it a few times, Ling quietly returned it there every morning. Tang handled errands and small deliveries between the manor, workshop, clinic, and nearby offices. Her memory for instructions was excellent. The town itself caused more trouble because Greywood changed too quickly for landmarks to stay reliable. An empty lot could become scaffolding within days, and a finished wall shortly afterward. Tang began stopping at intersections long enough to reconsider directions before committing to the next street. Laurian preferred that hesitation to the pride of people who kept walking the wrong way, because turning around felt embarrassing. One afternoon, a soft crash sounded in the corridor outside his study. Laurian opened the door and found Tang on the floor holding one knee. A teapot and two cups lay overturned beside her, while water soaked across the wood. She admitted she had taken the corner too fast and hit the wall before she could slow down. Laurian checked the knee himself. The fabric had torn slightly, but there was no blood and no sign of serious damage. That was the only measurement in the scene he actually cared about. Spilled tea cost minutes. An injured knee could cost several days of walking and create pain that served nobody. Laurian told Tang there was no reason to run ordinary errands, as if the manor were under attack. She promised to slow down, cheeks still colored with embarrassment. Laurian went back into the study and returned with a small jar of ointment. He told her to apply it before the swelling increased and said the leg should feel better by morning. Tang thanked him quietly. Her tale betrayed a mixture of relief and embarrassment while she tried to keep her face composed. Laurian told himself any competent employer kept medicine for people under his roof. That explanation was true enough to avoid examining why he had fetched it personally. Ling had watched from farther down the hall. She said nothing and allowed herself only a small smile before returning to work. Days accumulated that way until the sisters stopped feeling like new arrivals and started feeling like part of the manor's normal operation. Both were careful around Laurian's private affairs. Serena's coaching during the journey north had clearly taught them not to touch documents, inspect sealed folders, or ask questions unrelated to their duties. Laurian valued that discretion nearly as much as loyalty. He had employed older men who never learned the difference between being trusted near information and being invited to consume it. Those men always became expensive eventually. One evening, Laurian returned from the workshop and found his desk reorganized. Drawings previously spread across several piles had been sorted by date and held down neatly under paperweights. Every quill in the holder had been freshly sharpened. The older quills were not discarded. They had been bundled into a small basket beside the desk. Laurian asked Ling whether the arrangement was hers. She admitted she had been counting how many pens he used each day. Most older quills still had useful life after sharpening, so she saved them in case new stock ever became scarce. Laurian sat with the answer for a moment. It was a tiny problem nobody had assigned her. solved before the shortage existed. He told Ling he appreciated the thought. The compliment colored her cheeks and curled the white-tipped end of her tail before she returned to the window without another word. Laurian also became increasingly aware that two competent, attractive foxskin women managing his private rooms created a distraction no spreadsheet could fully classify. Foxskin seemed to carry a natural physical charm, whether they intended to use it or not. He noticed it. He also had steam engines, wolf programs, weapons factories, and more than 100,000 residents competing for the same attention. Whatever category the sisters created in his private thoughts remained below the line where decisions were made. 9 days after the mountain expedition departed, a sentry reported Aiden's return. The group had beaten Laurian's deadline by a full day. He left the work on his desk and went directly to the reception room. Aiden sat there covered in dust with one sleeve torn and a cup of water disappearing faster than politeness allowed. 3 of the 5 hunters had returned with the main group. The other 2 remained at a small mountain outpost guarding supplies for future teams. Laurian skipped greetings and asked for the route. Aiden immediately unrolled the new map. It contained far more detail than the version they carried out, with fresh ink added during the expedition rather than reconstructed comfortably afterward. The first 2 days crossed old pine forest, where thick needles created stable footing beneath the group. By the 3rd day, exposed rock and steeper slopes forced sections of hand-over-hand climbing. That same day, they identified a level site beside a stream, sheltered enough from wind to serve as a strong future camp. On the 4th day, the party climbed onto a broad plateau covered in wild grass, low brush, and tracks from mountain sheep. The open ground offered better visibility and less risk of walking into an ambush. Aiden's team marked the plateau with a shaved pine pole and red cloth visible from a long distance. The marker looked trivial beside the map, but Laurian understood its cumulative value. Every later expedition could save hours by seeing the exact point without wandering along the ridge searching for the same place. Then Aiden reached the discovery that changed the value of the scouting mission entirely. Large wolf tracks covered the northern side of the plateau. Some were fresh, some older, and many overlapped enough to make an exact count difficult. The hunters estimated more than 20 animals. The prints were also larger than those left by ordinary gray wolves. The eldest hunter identified them as mountain gray wolves, first-tier magical beasts that did not normally gather in such numbers. A pack that large suggested either unusually rich hunting or an alpha powerful enough to hold aggressive animals together. The tracks remained concentrated around the same territory, instead of scattering across the route. That mattered because Greywood could find the pack deliberately again. A roaming group might vanish before the next team arrived. A stable hunting ground could become an operational objective. Earlier in Laurian's life, more than 20 magical wolves beside a planned trade corridor would have been classified as a threat to remove. Now the werewolves changed the calculation. Reinald's trainees possessed the ability to communicate with wild wolves through scent, posture, and specialized calls. What had once looked like predators blocking a road now looked like animals that might become mounts. Laurian asked how far the core territory sat from the plateau route. Aiden estimated about half a day's travel. The wolves had not approached the expedition camp, probably because the fire and number of armed humans discouraged them. Laurian declared the mission successful and rewarded everyone with the promised bounty, plus 3 additional days of rest. Then he summoned Reinald. The retired veteran entered, still carrying the smell of animal pens on his clothes. His expression changed the moment Laurian said, "There might be more than 20 mountain gray wolves in one stable pack." Reinald called it a rare opportunity. Werewolves could open the first line of communication with wild packs in ways ordinary handlers could not duplicate. If the alpha accepted them as dominant or worthy outsiders, the process could potentially settle without a major fight. If the Wolf King rejected them violently, the options became much uglier. They could withdraw and abandon that pack, or they could kill the alpha and attempt integration under another leader. Laurian asked how much of that risk the current werewolves were actually ready to handle. Reinald estimated the trainees understood around 70 to 80% of basic commands. That was enough for supervised contact, but not enough to send them into unknown mountain territory alone. He volunteered to take 3 or 4 werewolves, personally for a first approach. The mission would locate the core range, identify the alpha, and measure the pack's response. Nothing beyond that. Laurian approved departure in 3 days, with enough food and medicine to survive either success or a cautious retreat. He repeated the same principle used with Aiden's scouts. Information mattered more than forcing a dramatic result too early. After Reinald left, Laurian looked toward the mountain ridge through the study window. If the program worked, Greywood could eventually field light cavalry riding intelligent magical beasts. No nearby territory possessed anything comparable. He opened the budget ledger and added funding for wolf pens and training space. That was as far as he allowed the fantasy to travel without evidence. The first investment would create the conditions for success. The wolves still had to choose whether success was possible. A few nights later, Butler Bal carried another stack of reports into Laurian's study, while early summer cold pressed against the windows. The hearth kept the room warm, and wood smoke had settled into the familiar evening smell of the manor. Bal began with the kind of news Laurian normally enjoyed. Greywood's population had passed 110,000. The main cement road had reached Handongling, and another section through Baytown had opened for regular use. Then Bal placed the problem beneath the progress. Transportation had become the newest bottleneck. Iron leaving Iron Cliff Fort still moved by horse cart and needed 3 or 4 days each way under decent conditions. Winter would make the same trip slower once ice and mud returned. Grain coming north from Okavan was already arriving with noticeable spoilage after spending too long in transit. Laurian considered spoiled grain money burned, after the entire production chain had already paid to grow, harvest, pack, and move it. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and looked at the contradiction in front of him. Greywood had spent heavily on smooth cement roads. Then it sent the same slow horse carts across them that would have crawled over dirt a generation earlier. The infrastructure existed, but the vehicle using it had barely changed. Moving people and goods faster had become one of the largest remaining levers in the territory's economy. Every road project was only partly useful, while travel speed remained limited by animal endurance. Laurian muttered that a trip taking several days should be possible in a fraction of that time, if the road itself was already good enough. Bal asked whether he meant something like the steam-powered road roller used by construction crews. Laurian stood and looked down at Greywood's main street under the first evening lamps. Workers were walking home. Miners still carried mud on their trousers, and smoke rose steadily from the blacksmith district. A thought from his previous life locked into place. Put a steam engine on a carriage and remove the horses entirely. Earth had experimented with steam road vehicles in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Those machines had been limited, partly because the roads beneath them were terrible. Railways eventually won, because steel tracks solved weight, rolling resistance, and guidance more efficiently. Greywood's conditions were different. The territory already possessed cement roads, functional steam engines, coal supplies, rubber processing, and improving steelwork. Many historical obstacles that crippled early steam carriages on Earth had already been solved here before anyone tried building one. Laurian told Bal to summon Copper Hammer and the Ed brothers first thing in the morning. He also wanted a 4-wheeled freight wagon brought in so the workshop could take apart something they already understood. Bal asked whether Laurian planned to modify the existing carriage. Laurian corrected him. He planned to build one that needed no horse at all. Bal stood still for a moment, then accepted the instruction and left before curiosity turned into another delay. Laurian pulled a clean sheet of parchment toward him and began sketching from memory. The general arrangement returned in pieces rather than as one perfect diagram. A horizontal boiler would produce steam. A piston would convert pressure into linear movement. A crank and connecting rod would turn that movement into rotation. The rear wheels could receive power, while the front wheels handled steering. Leaf springs would reduce shock from the road, and the passenger body needed enough space to justify the weight of the entire machine. Laurian remembered early steam carriages, moving around 10 to 15 miles per hour under practical conditions. That sounded unimpressive beside modern cars from Earth. Against a loaded cart moving near walking speed for days, it represented a completely different transport system. The real problems were not raw motion. Braking and vibration could kill the project faster than lack of speed. Cement was smooth compared with dirt, but it was nothing like a railway. If the chassis shook too violently, connections could loosen, and a boiler failure could become lethal. If the brakes were weak, every downhill section would turn the vehicle into an uncontrolled piece of iron, carrying passengers toward whatever stood at the bottom. Laurian redrew the layout repeatedly, while the candle beside him burned lower. The lines gradually stopped contradicting one another. After more than an hour, the drawing looked coherent enough to survive being shown to craftsmen. Then Laurian switched from mechanics to the numbers that decided whether an invention deserved capital. Coal had a cost, water stations had a cost, drivers had to be trained and paid, maintenance required labor and spare parts. Tickets had to remain cheap enough that ordinary travelers chose the service over familiar carts. Even at moderate fares, one round trip carrying around 20 passengers could produce thousands of silver coins in yearly revenue. That calculation still underestimated the real value. A merchant who reached a market a day sooner sold fresher goods and returned to buying faster. Farmers could reach buyers without losing produce during long journeys. Workers could move between towns without sacrificing several days of wages just to travel. The bus could be profitable by itself, while also increasing the profitability of every road connected to it. A soft voice interrupted the arithmetic. Li Jinshu stood at the doorway holding a cup of tea, while Aiwan waited a step behind her. She had noticed the light still burning and came to see whether Laurian had forgotten the hour again. Laurian accepted the tea and asked why she was still awake herself. Her eyes had already settled on the strange drawing. She asked whether it was some kind of carriage. Laurian explained that it would become public transport driven by a steam engine instead of horses. Li Jinshu leaned over the desk and followed the clearer lines with more confidence than she would have shown a month earlier. Night classes had already given her enough basic mechanics to recognize boilers, pistons, and simple gearing. The idea of putting those parts on a moving vehicle still surprised her. She asked the obvious question. How could the carriage move if nothing pulled it from the front? Laurian reduced the mechanism to the shortest explanation possible. Steam pushed the piston. The piston turned the crankshaft. The crankshaft turned the wheels. As long as coal and water kept entering the system, the machine could continue moving without tiring like an animal. Li Jinshu's expression shifted toward wonder. She remembered crossing the misty mountains partly on foot and partly by mule to reach Greywood. A reliable machine like this would have changed the entire journey. She asked how large Laurian expected the finished vehicle to be. He pictured something around the length of 2 ordinary carriages, with room for roughly 20 people. It should move around twice as fast as normal carts under load. A lamp on the front could allow travel after sunset instead of forcing every journey to stop when daylight disappeared. Li Jinshu asked whether fuel and a trained driver would make the service too expensive for ordinary residents. Laurian admitted the first machines would not be cheap to build. Once running, though, the cost per mile should fall well below repeated horse feeding, rest, replacement, and stable expenses on long routes. The greater value remained regional mobility. When people moved more freely, goods moved with them. When goods moved more quickly, income followed through dozens of businesses that never owned the vehicle themselves. Li Jinshu had lived in Greywood long enough to notice the pattern. Laurian's money-making projects usually strengthened public infrastructure at the same time. He rarely separated profit from the conditions that made future profit easier. She asked when construction would begin. Laurian told her Copper Hammer and the others were arriving the next morning to attack the technical problems he had not solved yet. Li Jinshu smiled and said she would continue practicing accounting that evening. Sylvius had warned her sword fighting might require another 6 months before she became truly competent. Accounting, by comparison, might become useful much sooner. Laurian told her she was learning quickly. Then he added that the future transport service would need someone reliable to manage tickets and revenue. The offer was casual enough to sound like another task. Li Jinshu understood the trust hidden inside it anyway. A princess capable of managing real accounts was worth more to Greywood than a noble who possessed nothing but etiquette and bloodline. She gave Laurian a proper Central Plains bow and wished him good night. After she left, he returned to the sketch. He remembered an old museum display from Earth, showing one of the crude early steam vehicles. The iron wheels, squat boiler, and tiny driver's compartment had looked almost ridiculous beside later technology. It had still represented the opening of an era. Laurian intended to open the same door on his own schedule. Before sleeping, he wrote one rule in the corner of the page. Build one test vehicle first. Run it long enough to collect real data. Scale only after the machine proved itself. Morning found Laurian already inside the workshop, beside a crude physical mock-up built from wood, sheet metal, and cast iron. He had assembled the model because blacksmiths trusted objects they could touch more than confident lines on parchment. Copper Hammer crouched beside the boiler section and tapped it with his knuckles, listening to the echo like a man judging livestock. Ed and Al studied the plans nearby, while several other smiths rotated parts in their hands and searched for failure points. Copper Hammer found the first major objection immediately. The machine was going to be heavy. He estimated the boiler alone could weigh 200 or 300 pounds. Add water, coal, frame, engine, passengers, and cargo, and the complete vehicle might approach 3,000 pounds. Laurian asked whether 4 wheels could carry it safely. He already had his proposed answer on the table. A strip of vulcanized rubber lay beside a steel hub sample. The wheels would use high-carbon steel for structural strength, with rubber around the outside, for grip and shock absorption. Raw rubber would soften under heat and wear too quickly. Vulcanized material could survive much higher temperatures and repeated load. Earlier tests showed each tire handling about 500 pounds on flat road. Laurian wanted the design improved until each wheel could safely carry closer to 800 pounds with margin remaining. Margin mattered because engineering at the exact expected load left no protection against bad roads, overloaded passengers, or imperfect manufacturing. Ed asked whether friction around the axle would still heat the rubber enough to soften it. That concern led directly into the bearing problem. Laurian unfolded another page showing a copper sleeve around polished steel balls between the axle and wheel. Ed liked the idea, but warned that an imperfect ball would seize once rotation and weight pressed against the same high point repeatedly. Copperhammer suggested casting the pieces oversize, then polishing them with sand and fine gravel using methods already proven on drilling equipment. The proposal shifted the question from theoretical precision into labor hours the workshop could actually estimate. Laurian let the craftsman argue over tolerances, rather than forcing a quick decision. Every objection raised now was one less expensive breakdown on a road months later. An argument that survived without Laurian controlling every sentence was more likely to survive after he stopped supervising the machine personally. They spent most of the morning working through weight distribution, axle strength, steering geometry seals, chain tension, and available boiler pressure. Laurian supplied remembered concepts from Earth, but made the Smiths fill gaps where memory became unreliable. Pretending to understand every detail would only convert his ignorance into someone else's injury. By noon, the group had a design worth funding. They would reinforce an existing four-wheeled chassis. A compact steam engine would sit low enough to reduce instability. A chain would transfer power to the rear axle. The front wheels would turn through a hand-operated gear system. The first machine would receive no expensive decoration. Unproven technology did not need polished panels, carved trim, or a beautiful passenger body. It needed proof that it could move, turn, stop, and survive the road. Laurian set a performance target around 30 miles per hour with a reliable, controlled stop. Copperhammer then asked how the carriage would carry enough fuel without becoming mostly coal and water. Laurian estimated a rear tank and bunker could support close to 100 miles under favorable conditions. Water stations placed about every 50 miles would reduce how much had to move with the vehicle at once. The first test route would be much shorter. Graywood Town to Red Leaf Ridge offered 36 miles of relatively straight, flat cement road. If the prototype failed there, repair crews could reach it easily, and nobody would have to recover 3,000 pounds of broken iron from a mountain pass. Laurian deliberately chose the cheapest place to fail. Copperhammer grinned and promised to begin immediately. One older blacksmith raised a social problem rather than a mechanical one. What happened to coachmen once? Passengers preferred machines that moved faster and needed no horses. Laurian answered that horses would remain useful for local routes, rough roads, short-haul freight, and places where building steam support made no sense. A transport network also created new work. Drivers, mechanics, coal handlers, station clerks, maintenance teams, inspectors, and repair crews would all be needed as the fleet expanded. Graywood was growing too quickly for Laurian to freeze one technology simply to preserve every job in its current form. After leaving the workshop, he passed the Iron Guard training ground, where Sylvia was drilling new recruits. Iron swords struck wooden shields in a steady rhythm, while a deputy watched spacing along the line. Sylvia noticed Laurian handed the exercise over and came to ask whether the steam vehicle had survived the morning meeting. Laurian told her Copperhammer was already pulling materials. Then he asked about Legion Shu's combat training. Sylvia said the princess possessed a strong technical foundation from years of Eastern martial practice. Her wrists and hips moved well, and she understood body control better than an ordinary beginner. What she lacked was the instinctive rhythm of a real fight. Controlled forms could teach position. They could not instantly teach the moment when another person changed intention in the middle of an attack. Sylvia estimated another 2 months before Legion Shu could reliably handle an ordinary infantryman. Laurian accepted that progress and moved to the next item. He intended to fence a plot outside the east gate for the new passenger terminal. Sylvia needed to design sentry positions and basic crowd control before the first real schedule began. Station collecting hundreds of travelers could produce theft, arguments, traffic jams, and panic even while producing excellent revenue. Security needed to exist before the crowd, rather than after the first incident proved it necessary. Sylvia acknowledged the assignment and then added news from the wolf program. Reinhold had returned from the mountains with a gray wolf cub. The wild pack had accepted the werewolf's scent closely enough that several animals remained nearby instead of fleeing. Full taming of a few adults might be possible within a month if contact continued well. Laurian refused to convert one good encounter into a deadline. The Wolf Rider project could develop beside the steam vehicle, instead of competing with it for every resource. Different investments reduced the risk of betting Graywood's future on one successful idea. That same afternoon, Li Jinshu left arithmetic class with several young women from the textile workshops. One asked whether the rumor about a carriage needing no horse was actually true. Li Jinshu confirmed it. She had already learned to translate Laurian's technical explanations into simpler language. The machine would work like the steamrollers they had seen on construction roads. Heat turned water into pressure, and the pressure became movement. Another worker immediately imagined visiting her mother in Ironcliff Fort without losing 4 days to a carriage journey. Li Jinshu looked toward the workshop chimney and the black smoke rolling from it. She remembered the rough sketches on Laurian's desk. Where she came from, crafts often followed inherited methods for generations, because tradition itself carried authority. Greywood changed so quickly that an empty lot could become a factory before people finished arguing about whether the factory was possible. Back at her quarters, Iwan had hot water waiting. Li Jinshu washed, sat down, and opened her abacus again. Her fingers moved through the beads with a growing rhythm. Iwan asked whether the princess truly intended to keep managing accounts. Li Jinshu answered that the task in front of her mattered more than the role she used to possess. She wanted to prove she could contribute something beyond royal blood and knowledge of rice cultivation. The workshop spent the next several weeks turning Laurian's design into a machine that could carry its own weight. Copper Hammer and 5 other blacksmiths stripped down the chassis of a heavy 4-wheeled wagon. They strengthened the slong frame members and installed leaf springs where the original carriage had relied on much simpler suspension. Ed and Al worked inside the alchemy shop on seals capable of surviving heat and pressure. They pressed cork and vulcanized rubber into gasket designs until leaks stopped appearing under repeated testing. Laurian visited almost every day except Sundays. Sometimes he brought calipers and measured parts himself. Sometimes he argued with Copper Hammer over whether a bearing needed more clearance before heat caused it to seize. Sometimes he simply watched, because craftsmen revealed problems faster. When the Lord stopped speaking for 5 minutes. After roughly 3 weeks, the first prototypes stood ready outside the workshop. Laurian deliberately looked at it like a customer, rather than like the man who had been waiting for it to exist. The machine was not attractive. A gray cylindrical boiler occupied the front above a cast-iron furnace. Protective wrapping covered the hottest surfaces, and a chimney rose from the boiler drum, with no attempt at elegance. A thick steam pipe fed one cylinder beneath the driver's seat. The engine drove the rear axle through a heavy cast-iron chain. The front wheels turned through rack and pinion steering. Behind the driver sat an open bench for around 10 people, followed by coal, water, and a toolbox at the rear. File marks remained visible across unfinished iron surfaces. The prototype looked like something built to answer a question rather than attract a customer. Copper Hammer wiped soot from his face and asked whether Laurian wanted to test it. Laurian walked the full length first. He checked important joints by hand, looked over the pressure fittings, and made sure the visible work matched the reports he had already signed. Then he ordered the tank filled and the furnace lit. Apprentices carried water while others packed firewood and coke into the firebox. Al used kerosene-soaked tinder to catch the fuel quickly. Smoke rolled from the chimney as the boiler began producing a low hiss. Workers from nearby shops stopped to watch. Merchants on the road slowed down. Neighbors gathered because a machine shaped like a carriage, but missing horses was difficult to ignore. Around 15 minutes later, the pressure needle reached the operating range. Laurian took the driver's position himself. He would not ask another man to discover whether the first steering failure ended in a ditch. Copper Hammer stood beside the steam valve, waiting for the signal. The brake used a rubber-faced cast-iron block, pressed against the drive assembly through a mechanical lever. Laurian ordered it released. The drive wheel shifted under its own weight, then stopped until the piston caught the next stroke. Copper Hammer opened the steam valve slowly. White exhaust burst from the outlet. The cylinder began working faster. The chain tightened. The rear wheels turned. The entire carriage shook once as stored weight became movement. Then it rolled forward at about walking pace. The crowd reacted with a strange mixture of gasps and laughter. People understood wheels and carts. Watching a cart move with no animal attached forced the mind to search for an explanation the eyes had already accepted. Laurian told Copper Hammer to increase steam. The valve opened farther. Piston rhythm sharpened, and the machine moved from a walk to a jog, then beyond the pace most loaded wagons could hold for long. Trees along the cement road began sliding past quickly enough that Laurian estimated the carriage around 35 miles per hour. The speed exceeded his first target. He did not celebrate yet. Laurian turned the steering gear gently and felt the front wheels respond almost too quickly. The body leaned through the curve more than he liked. The leaf springs were still too soft for a tall, heavy machine moving that fast. He called for a controlled slowdown before testing his luck against inertia. Copper Hammer reduced steam and pulled the brake gradually. Rubber pads bit the drive wheel with a loud squeal. The carriage stopped within roughly 30 feet. The watching crowd erupted behind them. Copperhammer grinned like the project was finished. Laurian climbed down and crouched beside the hubs. Excitement could hide heat, cracks, and loose fittings from people who wanted a success badly enough. The hubs were warm but not dangerously hot. The rubber had not softened. The bearings still turned cleanly. Boiler pressure and water level remained stable. A passing merchant asked whether he could reserve a seat on the next trip. Laurian told him the carriage had survived one afternoon and had not yet earned the right to carry paying customers. Then he listed what needed correction. The brakes were too loud. The body rolled too much during turns. The bare bench would punish passengers long before a 2-hour journey ended. Copperhammer's shoulders tightened until Laurian continued. He had 1 month to take the machine apart, correct the problems, and build another unit beside it. The next version needed a roof, windows, safer suspension, and seats people could actually tolerate. Relief replaced tension on the blacksmith's face. The residents closed in around the stopped prototype as soon as Laurian stepped away. An old coachman touched one rubber tire and worried aloud that nobody would want his carriage once a machine moved faster without eating hay. A young soldier reminded him that the steam vehicle still did not carry every kind of freight or reach every road. The crowd laughed, and Laurian allowed the mood to stay light. Public curiosity had already begun advertising the invention more effectively than a printed notice could. The next morning, Teacher Parker used the test during night school. He told Lee Jinshu and the other students that arithmetic, mechanics, and physics were not abstract subjects kept alive for examinations. They were the raw material of machines that could change how ordinary people traveled. Lee Jinshu looked down at her abacus and recognized that her trust in Laurian had changed. It was no longer based on the feeling that he somehow knew what he was doing. She had watched enough impossible projects become real to treat his confidence as a conclusion supported by evidence. Laurian still refused to launch the vehicle after one successful run. Over the next 2 weeks, Copperhammer's crew completed several rounds of improvements. Brake pads received thicker cork and rubber. The leaf springs were reshaped to reduce body roll. A rainproof canvas roof appeared over the passenger area. Simple wooden backrests replaced the exposed bench arrangement. The third revision rode more quietly and recovered faster after turns. Then Laurian ordered a real road test. The machine would run all 36 miles from Greywood Town to Redleaf carrying a simulated full passenger load. Sandbags equal to roughly 15 adults filled the body. Copperhammer drove while Laurian sat beside him recording speed, pressure, water use, fuel consumption, and anything that felt wrong. They left the east gate at 8 in the morning. The weather stayed dry and the cement road remained in nearly ideal condition. The engine settled into a steady rhythm between roughly 30 and 35 miles per hour. White steam and gray smoke trailed behind the carriage as fields passed faster than any cart around them could match. They stopped once at a planned supply point for about 20 minutes. The crew refilled water and cleared ash from the furnace before continuing. The carriage reached Redleaf Crossroads at 9:27. The entire trip, including the stop, had taken 1 hour and 27 minutes. That was roughly double the practical speed of horse transport over the same route. Villagers and the local steward came out to inspect the smoking iron machine. The steward stared long enough that his mouth remained open before the first question appeared. Had the carriage truly come all the way from Greywood that morning? Laurian stepped down, stretched stiffness from his shoulders, and confirmed it had. The steward immediately noticed another advantage. The machine ate no hay. Then he noticed the new dependency and asked where the coal would come from. Laurian produced a handwritten supply plan from his coat. Coal and water stations would sit at each end of the first route, with additional points added as the network expanded. One bus would depart in the morning, rest and refuel, then return by afternoon. The initial fare would be 2 copper coins per passenger. That was close to what a horse carriage already charged, while offering far better speed. A villager in the crowd calculated aloud that someone could travel to town, sell eggs, buy cloth, and return home within the same day. The steward worried that passenger tickets might not cover costs after curiosity faded. Laurian explained the next stage. A trailer could carry several hundred pounds of freight behind the passenger body. Once the service stabilized, timber, stone, tools, food, and other goods would use the same routes. The Riverbend Bridge still needed reinforcement before Laurian allowed heavy cargo across it. He had no intention of discovering the bridge's true limit, while a loaded trailer sat in the middle. After the crowd thinned, the steward asked whether nobles elsewhere would consider the horseless carriage unnatural or offensive. Laurian answered with the force he trusted more than outrage: convenience. If one service moved people twice as fast for nearly the same price, customers would choose it without needing ideological permission. Those who refused to adapt would eventually discover that tradition did not purchase empty seats for them. That afternoon, Li Jinshu found another crowd, gathered around a new notice board after night school. The posted schedule listed departure times, intermediate stops, luggage limits, lower prices for children, and a monthly pass for Greywood residents. She stood there longer than necessary. Her old court had discussed regional road improvement for years and repeatedly lost the plan inside bureaucracy and inherited craft methods. Greywood had moved from a rough sketch to public timetable in less than 2 months. Awan pushed closer, saw the fair, and suggested they ride to Redleaf one day simply to see the territory. Li Jinshu agreed while already calculating something else. Reliable transport would increase trade volume, station foot traffic, and the value of every nearby property. She suspected that Laurian had priced that land mentally before anyone else realized it had become important. That evening, Laurian recorded the road test in detail. Speed and fuel consumption came first. Then he added remaining mechanical problems: a better shock absorption, a dust cover around the chain, and improved driver visibility. Operational details followed. Different ticket colors could identify stations and fare sections. Revenue needed regular settlement rules so missing. Copper did not disappear inside a busy station. Driver reports would track unusual road conditions and mechanical behavior after every run. Laurian understood that inventions became systems only when boring procedures supported them. After the inventor went home, he looked out at the evening sky and allowed himself one larger conclusion. Steam buses were only the opening move. Freight trailers, additional routes, stations, and connecting roads could gradually tie the whole North into one transport network, with Greywood at the center. Ling called through the door that dinner was ready. Laurian closed the notebook and put the map away. The machine was already moving. The economic consequences had barely started. Once the road test proved the concept, Laurian turned the empty ground beside the East Gate into the first real public transport station in the North. The terminal went up in red brick after weeks of continuous labor, with a waiting hall roughly 40 feet long, a sheltered platform, benches, and a stove for cold weather. Fresh paint still smelled of turpentine beneath the sign identifying the building as Greywood Town Public Passenger Transport Terminal. On the first official morning, Laurian stood at the platform edge, studying the finished vehicle, as critically as he had studied the ugly prototype. Greywood Number 1 now wore thin iron paneling around the boiler, real glass windows, 2 rows of benches, and a narrow aisle between roughly 20 seats. A small cargo space occupied the rear, enough for luggage and light freight without forcing passengers to sit beside coal and tools. Harry, a young apprentice from Copperhammer's workshop, had earned the driver's seat by learning steam engines faster than men twice his age. He looked nervous enough to understand the responsibility, which Laurian preferred to the confidence of someone who had not imagined failure yet. Laurian told him to leave on schedule, rest 3 hours at Redleaf, refill water and coal, and return only after checking the machine properly. Anything unusual along the route had to be written down and delivered to the station office before memory turned a useful detail into an anecdote. Harry confirmed the instructions and pulled the brass whistle, sending a sharp scream across the platform that made children cover their ears. The furnace brightened, steam rolled from the chimney, the chain tightened, and the carriage moved away without a horse anywhere near the front. 16 passengers occupied the first public run, most visiting relatives or carrying small goods they hoped to sell in Redleaf. 2 Iron Guard soldiers rode along to record road conditions, while a 2-wheeled trailer carried nails and tools for the repair crews outside town. Laurian watched the blue carriage disappear around the bend, then turned back toward the waiting hall instead of romanticizing the departure. More people were already arriving for the next service, which mattered far more than applause from spectators who never intended to buy a ticket. A woman with a baby sat beside a basket of eggs and cheese, while 2 merchants questioned the clerk about the afternoon timetable. An old man crouched near the wall and ran his palm across the finished floor, with the concentration of someone testing whether the building itself was real. Laurian counted occupied benches, luggage, conversations, and the length of the ticket line before moving toward the construction site behind the terminal. The open lot beside the station covered several large fields, its future shape marked by white lime lines, wooden stakes, and ropes across yellow dirt. Workers had already begun digging foundation trenches, while carts delivered brick, timber, stone, and stacked bags of cement from different parts of Greywood. Constant movement made the station and construction site feel like one machine, passengers arriving on one side, while a commercial district was being excavated on the other. Li Jinshu approached, carrying a bound ledger containing the station's first meaningful operating numbers rather than classroom exercises. She reported that current traffic supported roughly 90 to 120 passengers per day, with demand likely to climb once residents trusted the schedule. Laurian asked for the cost calculation before celebrating the headcount, because full seats could still lose money if the machine consumed too much fuel and repair labor. Li Jinshu had included vehicle depreciation, road maintenance, coal water, lubricant, driver wages, and station expenses, instead of presenting only the flattering numbers. Her estimate placed operating cost around a tenth of a copper coin per passenger mile under the current route conditions. At existing fares, each trip still cleared several silver coins in net profit, and freight trailers could raise that return significantly once cargo operations expanded. She estimated the construction cost of one carriage could be recovered in roughly 2 months at the current traffic level. Later vehicles should repay themselves faster because the workshop would stop rediscovering every manufacturing step on each build. Laurian accepted the calculation, then asked her to look past the moving bus and imagine the entire empty lot filled with commerce. Li Jinshu pictured the kind of post station districts she had known in the East, where tea stalls, inns, cloth sellers, and repair shops clustered around travelers. She said the location would naturally thrive because people gathered there whether merchants planned for it or not. Every traveler needed food, rest, storage, replacement goods, and somewhere to spend waiting time before departure. Laurian agreed with the logic, but wanted something more deliberate than a market growing, wherever the first shopkeeper happened to place a table. He described a 4-story mall occupying the main site, designed as the commercial anchor for the transport district rather than another collection of independent stalls. The ground floor would hold daily goods, food, fabric, household tools, and the products ordinary travelers were most likely to need immediately. The second floor would contain a restaurant, bar, and small theater, giving people reasons to remain in the building after finishing practical errands. Higher floors would provide storage, private business rooms, and offices for merchants who wanted permanent operations instead of temporary stalls. The surrounding streets would be planned at the same time, with cement paving, glass storefronts, kerosene lamps, and drainage connected to underground pipes. Laurian wanted a southern merchant stepping into the district for the first time to feel that everyone already operating there had gained a head start. Li Jinshu understood that the real target was not Greywood residents, whose trade was already captured by the local economy. She asked whether Laurian intended to bring in merchants from the imperial heartland and the southern provinces. He explained that the north was already effectively connected through Greywood, Redleaf, White River, Iron Cliff, Winter, and the routes controlled by his administration. Every major caravan in those regions either answered directly to his system or depended on roads, security, and markets he had built. The next layer of growth required merchants who already possessed distant networks, capital contacts, specialty suppliers, and access to markets. Greywood could not efficiently build from nothing. If those traders established branches beside the station, northern goods could reach the capital, southern cities, and even overseas buyers through networks other people had already paid to create. Specialty imports could return along the same routes, reducing the pressure on Serena's Nightingale Guild to handle every distant connection by itself. Li Jinshu raised the political risk immediately, reminding Laurian that the capital already treated him as a troublesome noble who had ignored important orders. Major merchant houses might fear being associated with someone officially regarded as disobedient, even if the products were profitable. Laurian answered that fear had a price, and high profit margins tended to discover it quickly. Once outside merchants traveled over Greywood's roads, slept safely at its stations, inspected local goods, and read the accounts of competitors already earning money, caution would begin negotiating against greed. He did not need merchants to trust his politics or admire his personality. He needed them to trust the number at the bottom of their own ledgers. A foreman arrived before Li Jinshu could answer, carrying blueprints and the kind of expression construction managers wore when soil ignored architecture. The southern foundation trench had reached soft, wet ground that could not safely support the planned wall without additional work. He asked whether the building should shift north, rather than spend time reinforcing a bad section. Laurian took the plans, crouched directly on the site, and spread them over the ground while Li Jinshu knelt beside him. The discovery did not threaten the mall concept, but it proved the building would be designed around real geology, instead of the neat assumptions drawn on parchment. While they discussed options, another steam whistle sounded from the road. linking the unfinished commercial district to the traffic that justified building it. Laurian soon called a product conference because a magnificent mall filled with ordinary merchandise would only become an expensive warehouse with glass windows. The meeting began in the morning, when he considered time spent talking least damaging to the rest of the workday. He kept the invitation list deliberately narrow, refusing to fill the room with officials whose only contribution would be their title. Butler Bal sat with a ledger open, ready to record every promise as a future obligation that would eventually require finished goods. Huffman represented civilian metalwork, while Catherine represented the daily goods group, after being moved from her previous textile role. Ella, the half-elf responsible for agriculture, sat quietly with the expression Laurian had learned to interpret as active inspection for weaknesses. Li Jinshu took her usual place, slightly the side, pen ready, tracking both the decisions and the logic behind them. Laurian spread 6 sketches across the table and announced that all 6 products would enter development at the same time. The launch window would be tied to the mall opening, allowing months for testing while construction created the future retail space. Bal had already questioned whether the Treasury could absorb 6 simultaneous failures if every project consumed materials without reaching market. Laurian answered that the Treasury could survive experimental waste more easily than Greywood could survive, becoming afraid to develop anything until perfection was guaranteed. The first sketch showed tall rubber rain boots reaching near the knee, with deep tread designed for mud and a cotton lining to protect skin. Laurian identified miners, night patrols, bricklayers, and farmers as the immediate users rather than fashionable customers. A worker spending hours in wet leather eventually developed blisters, cracked skin, sickness, and lost shifts, all of which reduced output far beyond the price of better footwear. Huffman studied the design and estimated the first molds alone would require about 5 days, because each size needed separate shaping for left and right feet. Laurian approved the time, then listened when Huffman raised the real technical risk, instead of allowing the meeting to become another deadline exercise. Poor rubber formulas stiffened and cracked in northern cold, which could make a boot fail exactly when winter made dry feet most important. Laurian sent Huffman to the Ed brothers with instructions to adjust vulcanization and carbon content until the compound survived freezing conditions without splitting. A product that failed during the first frost would damage Greywood's reputation more than delaying release by another week ever could. The second sketch showed a rain cape made from coated canvas, with simple ties and sealed seams instead of complicated tailoring. Catherine noticed Laurian had ignored the thread problem while concentrating on waterproof surfaces. Ordinary hemp thread could weaken after absorbing glue, so she proposed wax thread or sewing the seam first and pressing the rubber seal over it afterward. Laurian approved her solution immediately because the purpose of hiring competent people was to let them correct him before customers had to. The cape needed almost no metal, no complex molds, and far less rubber than the boots, making it one of the easiest products to scale quickly. A cheap coat that preserved an entire rainy workday could return more economic value than its profit margin suggested. The third product was safety matches, a box of small wooden sticks more strategically interesting to Laurian than their appearance could justify. Thin pine stems would be cut in batches, dipped into a sulfur, resin, and phosphorus mixture, dried, then packed beside a prepared striking surface. The process divided naturally into simple repetitive steps, meaning inexperienced labor could produce volume after limited training. Huffman asked where enough phosphorus would come from if Laurian expected daily output in the thousands. Laurian explained that Al's workshop was already extracting small yields from ash and phosphate rock and refining safer material from the more dangerous forms. The current volume was thin but sufficient for a trial line, and a dedicated furnace could follow only after demand justified the investment. Catherine calculated that simple stamping, hand-dipping, drying racks, and packaging could push production beyond 1,000 boxes relatively quickly. Laurian set the first serious target at 2,000 boxes per day. Each tin would hold roughly 50 matches and sell for 3 copper coins, while mass production could drive the material cost to only a small fraction of 1 copper coin. The margin was extraordinary for something made from pine, simple chemicals, and stamped metal. Laurian still cared about the safety value as much as the profit. Every winter, households started dangerous fires while struggling with flint, poor tinder, and darkness, and a reliable match could remove that entire sequence. The fourth sketch drew more attention from Li Jinshu than from the metalworkers because the object solved a problem familiar to long-distance travelers. Laurian described a thermos flask using a double-wall glass liner with the air removed between layers and reflective silver coating to reduce heat loss, A cork stopper and outer shell would protect the glass, while properly sealed construction could keep water hot for roughly 12 hours. The main difficulty was not understanding the idea, but producing glass necks precise enough to join and sealing the vacuum without destroying the liner. Silver plating was already within Greywood's capability because the alchemy workshop had used similar chemistry for mirrors. Huffman admitted his forge crew did not include glassworkers skilled enough for the delicate sealing operation. Laurian had anticipated the shortage and arranged for Anglu's glass shop to lend 2 experienced blowers if Huffman created a dedicated workspace. The 5th sketch was a hand-cranked threshing machine, using steel gears and toothed rollers to separate grain from stalks much faster than manual beating. Ella ran one finger along the gear ratios and stayed quiet long enough for Laurian to know she was calculating labor, rather than deciding whether she liked the drawing. She finally pointed out that even a strong worker could clear only limited acreage in one long day using traditional methods. If the machine tripled or quadrupled that rate, the approaching harvest labor shortage could become manageable instead of catastrophic. Laurian wanted between 3 and 4 acres per day under skilled operation, with workers rotating the crank before fatigue destroyed the advantage. Ella immediately asked about jams, stripped gears, and what happened if continuous load bent the roller or seized a bearing. Laurian specified high-carbon steel for moving parts and reused the bearing knowledge developed during the steam vehicle project. The first prototype was already close enough to completion that it could reach the agricultural station within days. Ella would choose experienced farmers for the trial and record both throughput and every failure, including small ones that craftsmen might prefer to hide. The 6th design existed for customers who had more money than practical needs. Laurian sketched vases, candlesticks, ornaments, and patterned glass using different metal oxides to create reliable color. Iron could create pale green, cobalt could produce deep blue, and manganese could generate purple tones impossible for most human workshops to control consistently. Elven stained glass still dominated the high-end market because ordinary human furnaces produced cloudy color and too many bubbles. If Greywood could create clean, repeatable batches, nobles and churches would pay enough for decorative pieces to subsidize many practical household products. Laurian had no objection to wealthy buyers funding cheaper matches, boots, or tools for people who would never own luxury glass themselves. Catherine admitted the glass itself belonged under Anglu's people, but her group could still handle velvet lining, presentation boxes, and eventual packaging. By the end of the meeting, every product had an owner, a timeline, and at least one technical risk clearly written beside it. Laurian gave everyone 1 week to produce a usable sample before anything moved towards small batch sales. The room emptied quickly once conversation turned into deadlines with names attached. Legion Shu remained to help Bal collect loose pages and ask the question Laurian had avoided saying aloud. Would spreading effort across 6 products starve all 6 just enough to make everyone mediocre? Laurian admitted the danger was real because resources and management attention remained finite even with an enormous treasury. Waiting for one product to reach perfection before beginning the next carried a different cost, potentially limiting Greywood to only 1 or 2 meaningful launches each year. He preferred parallel development with frequent correction, the same method that had turned experimental steam equipment into a working passenger service. The mall needed several months before opening, creating a natural period during which factories could improve both products and worker skill together. Laurian expected the first samples to be rough and budgeted for failure, instead of treating every defect as proof the idea should be abandoned. Li Jinshu accepted the reasoning and left with the ledger, while Laurian watched quarry carts pass the staked foundation beyond the window. He kept telling himself the 6 sketches represented nothing more emotional than future inventory categories. The fact he no longer believed himself did not change the work waiting the next morning. The mall's first serious construction delay came from the soft soil the foreman had discovered near the southern wall. Decker, an older stonemason Laurian trusted precisely because he knew when to stop, refused to pour foundation over ground that behaved like wet ash. Around 4 feet down, the trench turned into gray-black silt so saturated that every shovel came up dripping instead of carrying clean earth. Laurian visited the site that afternoon and rolled a handful of mud between his fingers before lifting it close enough to smell. The faint odor of rotted plant matter suggested the location had once been a shallow ditch later, filled with loose soil and runoff. A heavy wall built directly over that material would continue settling long after construction finished. The building might look perfect at opening, and begin cracking only after tenants had moved in, when correction cost several times more. Laurian told Decker to keep digging until the crew reached firm soil at least 6 feet below the original surface. Large rubble set in cement mortar would create the first stable layer, followed by compacted crushed lime before the foundation beam rose above it. Decker recorded the instructions with charcoal on scrap wood, then pointed out that the quarry was already committed to crushed stone for roadwork. Whole rubble would require several days of notice and might slow another infrastructure project. Laurian chose the foundation. A road could remain unfinished for several more days without becoming permanently defective. A wall poured on unstable ground did not receive a second chance after 4 floors, and paying tenants were placed above it. He told Decker to route the request through BAL and delay roadstone if the quarry could not supply both jobs simultaneously. The foreman's shoulders loosened because he had clearly expected pressure to maintain the visible schedule at the expense of invisible stability. Laurian remained at the trench until several deeper shovel loads showed cleaner soil, then walked away before his presence became performance. The southern foundation took almost twice as long as the northern side and consumed days of paid labor with almost nothing impressive to show visitors. Laurian considered that exactly the type of expense a responsible project should contain. Nobody applauded a foundation for not cracking 20 years later, but the absence of disaster was often the return on money spent correctly. He continued visiting the site almost every day, discussing drainage, stone placement, and material deliveries, even when none of those visits changed the schedule. Decker still understood the message created by repetition. A lord who kept appearing beside the same trench had decided this building mattered enough that small shortcuts could eventually reach his desk. Not far from the mall, Huffman's workshop had divided itself into 2 different industrial cultures under one roof. Traditional anvils and forges still produced gears and metal parts on one side. The other side now held rubber, cotton, sheet metal, sulfur fumes, and experimental processes many older smiths barely considered blacksmithing. Some veterans grumbled that one workshop should focus on one trade, but the output figures after the division made the argument increasingly difficult to defend. Huffman assigned the first rain boot experiment to a young apprentice named Thomas, whose previous experience mostly involved patching carriage tires. He gave Thomas a wooden shoe last, rubber paste, and instructions to build the boot through repeated layers, letting each coat set before adding the next. 2 days later, the apprentice produced a pair so crooked the boots could not stand upright by themselves. The failure consumed material and labor, but Huffman refused to turn it into a public humiliation. He rebuilt the last with a metal support plate, changed to thicker rubber stock, and separated the sole from the upper, instead of molding everything as one continuous piece. Thomas had to stand beside him through the rework and watch exactly where the original method had failed. By the second boot, the apprentice was holding the hot glue brush himself under supervision rather than being pushed aside permanently. The revised pair came out rough around the seam, but structurally sound enough for actual tests. Huffman submerged one boot in water for a full hour. The inside remained dry. That result was good enough for him to carry the pair to the Manor Terrace, where Laurian and Lee Jinshu were reviewing mall business figures. Laurian turned the boot in his hands, pressed the tread with his thumb, and handed it to Lee Jinshu. Instead of pretending visual inspection could determine comfort, she hesitated before removing her own shoe, then pulled on the men's medium prototype and took several careful steps across the terrace stone. The shaft was obviously too loose for her leg, but the sole gave more stable footing than she expected. Lee Jinshu suggested thick socks or a felt insert could reduce empty space until dedicated women's sizes were ready. Huffman explained that he was already preparing smaller lasts and shorter shafts rather than expecting every customer to adapt to one shape. Laurian liked that he had moved beyond the minimum assignment without another order. Huffman also reported the boot had survived 2 hours packed in crushed ice after the water test. The rubber stiffened slightly, but did not split. Laurian approved another revision with smoother seams and a soft fabric collar around the opening to reduce chafing during long shifts. Then 10 pairs would go to Iron Guard night patrols for real wear testing in cold mud instead of remaining clean inside a workshop. Their complaints would determine the next version. On paper, the patrol issue counted as inventory written off to testing. In Laurian's mind, it also meant 10 men might stop ending wet shifts with blistered feet while the experiment gathered useful data. Lee Jinshu changed back into her own shoes and said products like those boots would give Southern merchants another reason to stop in Greywood. Laurian told her one durable product was not enough because a customer might buy boots once and keep them for years. Merchants built routes around continuous traffic, not a single excellent purchase. The mall had to become valuable because thousands of people pass through it to eat, sleep, trade, meet clients, and wait for transport. Laurian opened the revised business projections and let Li Jinshu check the arithmetic instead of asking her to trust his conclusion. 24 shops paying regular monthly rent could generate more than 1,000 silver coins yearly before restaurants, rooms, freight fees, or bus commissions were included. The building could potentially recover its construction cost inside a year if traffic met conservative expectations. That profit still was not the main objective. Laurian wanted southern merchants to enter Greywood, discover better rubber goods, glassware, machinery, and tools, then establish their own trading posts around those products. An economy dependent on one ruler, personally inventing every market, would eventually stop growing the moment his attention reached its limit. Li Jinshu proposed sending the commercial invitation under the Nightingale Guild's name rather than Laurian's official letterhead. Serene already possessed southern credibility, while many merchants had reasons to distrust a northern lord associated with conflict against the capital. Laurian considered the idea better than his own first version and told Li Jinshu to draft the investment letter for review. The suggestion mattered because she was beginning to solve Greywood's problems, instead of only learning how Laurian solved them. 11 days after the product conference, the reports coming back from the workshops showed more progress than Laurian had expected from the schedule. The rain boots had reached a third revision after the night patrol reported chafe, poor grip in deep mud, and sweat trapped inside overnight. Huffman had walked the patrol route himself, rather than treating a complaint sheet as complete reality. He saw where the mud collected, how long men remained on their feet, and why the original tread failed on slick sections. The next version used deeper horizontal grooves, a soft leather lining around the opening, and a removable cotton pad that could be washed and dried separately. Catherine completed several raincoat samples at the same time using coated canvas, wax seams, and narrow rubber strips pressed along both sides. A mannequin left under simulated rain for an entire day stayed dry beneath the fabric. Catherine also added a tie-down hood at the collar without being asked. Laurian wrote her name beside the change in the product record instead of allowing useful initiative to disappear under a generic workshop label. The thresher reached the agricultural station and received its first real field test under 3 farmers rotating the crank. It processed roughly 1.5 acres of wheat while operating around 4 times faster than hand threshing. Efficiency passed 90%, and Ella's primary complaint concerned grain spraying from the discharge alongside straw. She recommended adding a baffle rather than changing the entire roller system. Laurian approved the modification. 4 times the throughput represented thousands of future hours. Farmers would not spend bent over threshing floors, even though the official report needed only the measurable efficiency. Then Huffman delivered the match sample. A small metal tin sat at the center of Laurian's desk, catching afternoon light across an embossed greywood mark. Inside were several dozen evenly cut sticks with dark red heads and a rough striking strip fixed to the side of the box. Laurian pulled one free and dragged it firmly across the prepared surface. The head caught with a hiss and produced a steady orange flame carrying the smell of sulfur and pine resin. Li Jinshu had watched enormous steam engines, roads, and water pipes appear without losing much composure. The tiny flame affected her differently because the mechanism fit inside one hand and replaced a daily inconvenience she understood immediately. She asked whether the match truly required nothing more than one strike against the box. Laurian handed the sample across rather than explaining again. Her first attempt came too lightly and produced sparks without a sustained flame. Li Jinshu frowned at the failure the same way she frowned at an account that refused to balance. She adjusted the angle and pressure herself instead of asking for another demonstration. The second match ignited cleanly. She watched the flame climb almost to her fingers before shaking it out into the dish. Every household in the north would want a box. Once people understood how easily it replaced flint and prepared tinder, she said. The word civilization slipped into her description before she seemed to realize how large it sounded. Laurian waved down the drama, but privately thought she was not entirely wrong. Much of civilized life consisted of small inconveniences removed so completely that later generations forgot anyone had once lived with them. Huffman had experimented with several side versions beyond the assignment. One burned longer. Another carried a faint pine scent. A longer stem could reach deep candles or fireplaces without bringing a hand close to the flame. Laurian refused to launch those variations immediately. The basic box needed to prove repeat demand before curiosity multiplied production into unnecessary complexity. The first market trial would use 2,000 boxes priced at 3 copper coins each through the station K6 and central exchange shops. Greywood would watch sales for 2 weeks before deciding how aggressively to expand the line. Laurian cared more about repeat purchases than first reactions. A customer returning for another box proved the match had become useful instead of merely interesting. Li Jinshu offered to track daily volume, first-time buyers, and repeat customers through the station accounts. Laurian approved because the responsibility gave her measurable operating experience and reduced the number of separate reports reaching his own desk. She placed the matchbox down carefully, visibly pleased by the assignment, even while keeping her formal expression under control. The thermos project remained less reliable. Glass shaping had improved, but vacuum sealing still destroyed roughly one liner in 3. Laurian ordered the team to stabilize the process before worrying about production volume. A cracked liner represented wasted skilled labor and could injure someone if the glass failed inside a travel bag. Speed could always be increased after consistency existed. A reputation for products that shattered in customers' hands would be much harder to repair. As evening settled outside, the workshop whistle marked the end of the day shift, while smoke still rose from night crews in the industrial district. Ling entered the study carrying a kerosene lamp and set it on the corner without interrupting the conversation. She had learned to provide exactly what the room needed, then disappear before useful service became another demand for attention. Laurian had come to rely on that quiet competence more deeply than he had ever told her. Li Jinshu rose to return to her quarters because she wanted to reach the station before the first morning departure and inspect early ticket records. She no longer asked Laurian to release her from work. She simply managed her own schedule and told him what she intended to complete next. He had stopped correcting that habit because self-directed reliability was the entire reason he trusted her with expanding responsibilities. After she left, Laurian placed the matchbox in a drawer, already crowded with steam bus figures, foundation records, boot complaints, thresher notes, and colored glass samples. None of the projects was finished. Everyone had become another branch of the same larger system he was building. Around Greywood's roads, workers, factories, and markets. Laurian closed the drawer and opened an old land survey book because the mall's future leasing boundaries still needed confirmation before the next stage could begin. A summer afternoon gave Laurian an excuse to move his paperwork into the manor courtyard, though very little paperwork was actually getting finished. Sylvie was sparring with Li Jinshu beneath the oak trees, both women using heavy wooden practice swords instead of live steel. The pace was controlled enough to teach, but hard enough that every mistake still punished the person who made it. Li Jinshu met one downward strike with both hands and was driven backward 2 full steps by Sylvie's superior strength. What caught Laurian's attention was not the retreat itself, but the curved path her feet followed while she gave ground. Instead of absorbing the force in a straight line, Li Jinshu bled it sideways through a smooth half-circle and kept her balance. That movement belonged to no Imperial sword school Laurian had ever watched, which made it more valuable than another ordinary sparring report. He called for a pause and asked Sylvie whether she had noticed the same thing. Sylvie had, and admitted the footwork felt completely different from the planted stability Imperial knights trained into their bodies. Li Jinshu stood breathing hard, uncertain whether Laurian had stopped the lesson because she had failed or because he had found something useful. Her retreat had not looked like panic. The half-circle was controlled enough that the force from Sylvie's strike traveled into movement instead of directly into Li Jinshu's arms. Laurian had spent enough time around workshops to recognize the principle, even if the martial application was foreign. Redirecting load instead of resisting it was still engineering. Only the material being managed was a human body. Laurian told her the second answer was closer to the truth. For months they had discussed rice, accounting, workshop output, and trade, while barely touching the power traditions of her homeland. That omission had become too large to ignore now. That one unfamiliar step had revealed how different those traditions might be. Li Jinshu glanced toward Han Yang, her recovered bodyguard, before deciding how much she was willing to explain. Then, she reminded herself that Laurian had saved both of their lives and given them protection when they had nowhere else to go. She told him that Great Xiao did not divide extraordinary people into only knights and mages. Its traditions were grouped into 7 broad paths, each with smaller schools that had spent generations refining their own methods. Martial artists tempered muscle, bone, blood, and internal energy until the body itself became the weapon. Li Jinshu described that path as the one closest to what Imperial Knights might recognize, though the underlying method remained different. The resemblance ended at disciplined bodies and battlefield application. Where Western Knights built battle aura outward, Eastern martial schools spent generations refining circulation, breath, tendons, organs, and technique from the inside. Taoist practitioners relied on talismans, ritual understanding, and communion with heaven rather than brute physical force. To Sylvie, the description sounded vaguely like priesthood mixed with magic. Li Jinshu resisted that simplification. A Taoist tradition might use signs, timing, written talismans, or cosmological rules in ways that did not map cleanly onto an imperial mage drawing power through familiar elements. Buddhist cultivators pursued hardened bodies and disciplines tied to karmic law, sometimes spending decades perfecting one foundation. Confucian scholars cultivated righteous will so deeply that at the highest levels, their words could suppress hostile spirits. The idea offended Sylvie's military instincts because nothing about reading books looked like a combat path. Li Jinshu's answer was that the tradition treated cultivated principle and will as force in their own right. A scholar who spent decades refining that discipline was no more ordinary than a knight who spent decades refining battle aura, even if one carried a brush instead of a sword. Sylvie openly doubted that scholars who lived behind books could ever threaten a trained knight. Li Jinshu answered with quiet pride that the greatest scholars of her homeland could scatter enormous gatherings of spirits with a single rebuke. That answer left Sylvie with no familiar category in which to place them. Li Jinshu continued with military strategists, artificers whose craft itself became a path to power, and poison masters from the southern wilds. 7 major traditions were only the beginning, because countless sects and local schools branched beneath them. Laurian recognized the strategic problem hidden inside the cultural richness. An army could prepare for one known knight doctrine and one known school of imperial magic. Preparing for 7 broad traditions multiplied by local branches was a completely different intelligence problem. The variety itself functioned as resilience, because no single countermeasure could cheaply answer every path. Laurian listened without interrupting and mentally compared the structure to an economy rather than a single combat system. Great Xiao had existed for thousands of years and held more than 100 million people by Li Jinshu's account. The empire was barely 2 centuries old and contained fewer than 10 million. Population and time created depth in institutions, technologies, and traditions, so the difference made uncomfortable sense to him. Greywood had grown rapidly, but Laurian knew a young frontier territory could not manufacture 3,000 years of accumulated technique overnight. The useful response was not pretending the gap did not exist. The useful response was identifying which pieces of that knowledge could be learned, traded for, or adapted before the gap became dangerous. Laurian turned to Han Yong and asked whether he followed the martial path. The bodyguard stepped forward, bowed first to Li Jinshu, and described himself modestly as a warrior of the Third Realm. Laurian asked him to compare Great Xiao's martial energy with the battle aura used by imperial knights. Han Yong explained slowly, because several of the concepts had no exact equivalent in the common language. He paused often to test words before using them. The difficulty made Laurian more careful about treating apparent similarities as exact matches. 2 cultures could both describe internal strength, while meaning entirely different processes, limits, and training assumptions underneath the translation. Imperial knights pushed life force outward and shaped it into battle aura around weapons, armor, or the body. Martial artists instead closed and strengthened the body, while drawing the energy of heaven and earth inward, through controlled breathing and circulation. That internal energy was called qi, and it was gathered, refined, and moved through the body, rather than thrown outside immediately. Laurian asked for a demonstration, because definitions without proof had never interested him for long. Han Yong faced a thick wooden training post and stopped his fist several inches before impact. The punch never touched the timber. Han Yong stopped with enough control that the empty space between fist and wood remained clearly visible. The crack, therefore, could not be dismissed as a hidden physical strike. Sylvie stepped closer afterward and inspected the damage herself because her training made her distrust demonstrations that violated familiar limits. A sharp crack still split across the post as invisible force struck it from that short distance. Sylvie's expression hardened at once. Within the imperial system, producing an effect like that at range demanded a level of control associated with far stronger knights. Han Yong's raw physical output did not appear to match that rank, yet his technique produced a result beyond what the numbers suggested. That difference mattered more to Laurian than the broken wood. A deep tradition had found ways to make refined technique outperform a simpler system's brute output. From Laurian's perspective, that was the same kind of advantage a better machine tool held over a stronger worker swinging a larger hammer. He crossed the courtyard, examined the crack with his own hand, then asked the question Sylvie clearly wished he would not ask. Laurian wanted to know whether he could learn it. The courtyard went quiet enough that the leaves overhead suddenly sounded louder. Sylvie remembered exactly why the question seemed ridiculous. Greywood's first resident mage had tested Laurian repeatedly and found no meaningful magical sensitivity in him at all. The failure had been thorough enough to become awkward. One ritual was repeated because the mage suspected an error. A second method produced the same silence. A third only confirmed that nothing in Laurian responded the way even a weak magical aptitude normally should. The humiliation had never mattered enough to become a public grievance, but Laurian remembered every failed reading clearly. 3 different detection methods had produced the same dead result. Laurian had later tried the Lionheart Breathing Foundation, used by countless Imperial swordsmen, and failed to produce battle aura there as well. That method was so common that ambitious second sons learned it before they owned decent armor. Laurian had followed the instructions privately and discovered the same absence he found with magic. No current, no spark, no sensation worth calling progress. Western power systems had rejected him twice by entirely different routes. To the Western systems around him, Laurian's body had always looked almost aggressively ordinary. Sylvie was already preparing the diplomatic version of telling her lord that a third failed experiment might be a waste of time. Han Yong hesitated for a different reason. Foundation techniques from Great Xiao were still part of his homeland's martial heritage, and giving them to a foreign ruler was not a trivial choice. His eyes moved to Li Jinshu and waited for the authority he still recognized in her. The displaced princess gave him permission without drama. Laurian had saved them, protected them, and never demanded their secrets as payment, so a basic foundation method was not too high a price. Han Yong accepted her decision and turned back to Laurian with the seriousness of a physician delivering an unfavorable diagnosis. Talent came first in martial cultivation, he explained, and the best foundations were normally built while the body was still young. Laurian had spent years bent over ledgers and dispatches, not conditioning bones and tendons from childhood. At his age, Han Yong doubted he could become a great martial artist, even if he trained faithfully. The method could still strengthen his health and extend his useful years, which Han Yong presented as the realistic goal. Laurian translated the politeness easily. He was being told that he was old, physically soft, and starting far too late to become impressive. That assessment did not offend him. Laurian had built half his current advantage from people, assuming he was too weak or too irrelevant to deserve close attention. The same assumption bought him quiet years to learn something useful. He was happy to accept the discount. He removed his vest, stepped onto the training stones, and asked where to begin. Han Yong put him into a horse stance and immediately corrected nearly every part of it. The bodyguard's hands were rough from years around weapons and made every correction impossible to ignore physically. He pushed Laurian's feet wider, adjusted the knees, changed the pelvis, and straightened the spine with no concern for noble dignity. Laurian preferred that honesty. A teacher worried about offending his title would preserve bad form simply to preserve etiquette. Feet wider, knees aligned, back straight, chest lifted, abdomen controlled, toes gripping the ground as though they were roots. Laurian's body protested within minutes. His thighs began burning, then shaking, and no amount of political authority could negotiate with muscles that had spent too much time under a desk. The contrast was personally ridiculous. Laurian controlled expanding territory, musket production, steam transport, and thousands of workers. None of those assets could keep his own knees from trembling. After a few minutes in the correct stance, he filed the embarrassment under motivation rather than injustice. He kept his complaints to himself. Commanding musket infantry while being defeated by a stationary crouch was humiliating enough without announcing it to the entire courtyard. Han Yong shifted from posture to breathing. Once Laurian could hold the position without collapsing, he instructed Laurian to let each breath sink below the navel toward the dantian instead of remaining high in the chest. The inhale should feel as though it traveled through the spine, while the exhale carried stale tension outward through the limbs. Most difficult of all, Laurian was told to stop thinking. That instruction was almost insulting in its impossibility. Laurian could silence his mouth easily. Silencing the internal calculation was different. His thoughts usually moved from silver returns to cement ratios, from southern rivals to labor shortages, and from one unfinished project directly into the next. Han Yong was effectively asking a factory to stop every machine simultaneously and call the absence of noise productive. Laurian's mind treated silence the way a workshop treated an unexpected power outage, as something fundamentally wrong that needed immediate correction. Budgets, road schedules, weapons production, and unfinished construction usually kept moving through his thoughts, even while he slept. He forced those calculations aside one at a time and followed Han Yong's breathing rhythm instead. For several minutes, nothing happened beyond the ordinary misery in his legs. Then a small warmth appeared low in his abdomen, It was faint, but it did not feel like imagination or ordinary body heat. The sensation moved with his breath and spread outward toward the muscles that had been trembling a moment earlier. The shaking eased enough that Laurian noticed the difference immediately. He made a small involuntary sound, and Han Yong's posture changed faster than Sylvie's had during the spar. The bodyguard stared at him as though the lesson had just violated a law he had trusted his entire life. Laurian kept breathing and asked what was wrong. Han Yong told him that sensing the first trace of qi should not happen this quickly. A gifted young student in Great Xiao might need 10 days or 2 weeks of guided practice, sometimes with medicine, before feeling anything at all. Han Yong did not offer the comparison casually. He had watched talented youths train under proper teachers and knew how slowly the first reliable sensation usually appeared. Laurian's result forced him to reconsider the diagnosis he had delivered only minutes earlier about age and mediocre prospects. Laurian had reached the same threshold in less than a quarter of an hour. For Han Yong, decades of experience had just been contradicted by a foreign lord with poor legs and no formal martial childhood. For Laurian, the shock took a different form. The moment the warmth appeared, several old failures suddenly fit together into one explanation. The body he inhabited belonged to Laurian Bohemia's bloodline and had been born under this continent's Western rules. That distinction explained why the body could function normally, while still refusing the local routes to extraordinary power. Laurian had spent years assuming he was simply unlucky. The new sensation suggested the failure was structural rather than random, which made it far more useful, because structural problems could be reasoned about. The consciousness driving that body, however, had come from Earth. Magic and battle aura had never responded, because the framework those systems expected did not match something deeper in the soul using the body. Great Xiao's cultivation method did match. Laurian thought of it less as destiny than as incompatible operating instructions finally being replaced by the correct set. The analogy fit his mind better than mystical language did. A machine could contain perfectly serviceable metal and still fail if every control signal reaching it was wrong. Change the interface, and parts that looked useless a moment earlier could suddenly behave exactly as intended. The hardware had never been completely useless. It had simply been asked to run software written for someone else. Once Han Yong supplied a framework that resonated with Laurian's earthborn instincts, the energy found a channel immediately. Laurian told Han Yong he could still feel the warm current resting below his navel. The bodyguard's earlier caution disappeared. In its place came the almost dangerous excitement of a martial artist who believed he had found a prodigy no reasonable theory could explain. Han Yong started speaking about grandmasters and how far Laurian might rise if he trained seriously for years. He pictured a future in which Laurian dominated opponents with his own hands. Laurian stopped that fantasy before it grew any more expensive. He had no desire to become a wandering martial legend or spend his life chasing duels. Han Yong's excitement had already jumped years ahead to grandmasters, regional fame, and a ruler personally overwhelming enemies. Laurian saw a much smaller requirement. If an assassin reached arm's length, he wanted enough strength and reaction time to survive until guards or a firearm ended the encounter. Anything beyond that was optional return on the same hour of training. Cultivation interested him for the same reason body armor interested him. If a powerful assassin ever crossed the guards, reached his study, and forced a close fight, Laurian wanted another layer between himself and death. His main weapons would remain musket squads, rifled artillery, and industrial production. A fourth-tier killer was frightening at arm's length, but far less impressive, while being shot from hundreds of meters away. That belief did not make Laurian dismiss martial experts. It made him refuse their preferred measurement of importance. A warrior might spend decades becoming terrifying inside 10 meters. An industrial state could spend those same decades improving weapons that made 10 meters an increasingly difficult distance to reach alive. Han Yong could spend years learning how to break stone with his hands, while Greywood's workshops were already making barrels that did the job from a distance. Laurian respected personal strength without confusing it for the future of warfare. Industrial firepower was changing the battlefield, whether old martial schools accepted the change or not. Still, extra protection under that new system was worth 1 hour of his morning. He ordered Han Yong to reserve that hour for stance, breathing, and controlled circulation every day. Han Yong agreed with the solemn enthusiasm of a teacher who had unexpectedly found the most interesting student of his career. Sylvie still did not understand the technical meaning of the key sensation. She understood Han Yong's face well enough. Whatever Laurian had touched in that courtyard, it had transformed a skeptical instructor into a believer within minutes. Laurian put his vest back on and returned to his paperwork before anyone could turn the discovery into a ceremony. The point was not becoming a legend. The point was acquiring another quiet advantage, while everyone else was still deciding whether it should have been possible. Several days later, an entirely different problem reached Greywood from the south. Laurian had not witnessed the events in Tulip territory himself, so the story came together through Serena's reports and werewolf intelligence. Count Valerius had personally descended into his dungeon after 3 days of relentless rain. Balin's steel anvil, the dwarven grandmaster Serena had been quietly courting, was chained to the wall with blood and mud dried into his beard. His 2 sons and his daughter had been imprisoned with him, exhausted enough that even anger seemed beyond them. Valerius considered Balan's attempted departure a personal betrayal after a decade spent hosting and rewarding the dwarf. In Valerius's version of events, fine drink, rare mineral status, and security should have purchased permanent gratitude. Balan saw the same decade differently. He told the Count that ornamental birds, jewelry clasps, and decorative mechanisms had reduced a master smith to a luxurious prisoner. The work was expensive, but it gave him nothing worthy of the craft he had spent his life mastering. Serena had changed that with 2 incomplete designs. One was a steam cylinder. The other was an early flintlock pistol mechanism. Those rough plans showed Balan a form of power that did not require a bloodline, divine blessing, or magical talent to reproduce. A competent craftsman with the right tools and understanding could make steam push a piston or make powder drive a projectile. To Balan, that possibility was worth more than every rare mineral Valerius had placed in his workshop. Valerius did not share the fascination. He heard only a dependent craftsman announcing that another patron had inspired greater loyalty. His wounded pride hardened into punishment. He revoked the family status as guests, declared all 4 dwarves slaves, and ordered them kept on bread and water. No one could approach the dungeon without his personal authorization. Any unauthorized visitor was to be killed immediately, regardless of rank. The news reached Serena through a werewolf scout, who had been watching movement around the southern border. Balan had been caught at a checkpoint in a disguised carriage, which meant Valerius almost certainly had a spy inside the workshop. The guards knew which carriage to search, when it would leave, and who they should expect to find. That level of precision did not come from luck. Serena took the capture personally for more than one reason. She had already been humiliated by Valerius at the White Gold Tavern and forced to surrender half her compass leasing rights in his territory. Now a craftsman she had tried to recruit had been enslaved with his entire family because he believed in Greywood's work. Her first response was anger, sharp enough to become operational planning. She ordered horses prepared and began considering an Iron Guard rescue in person. 30 elite soldiers with muskets and alchemical grenades could infiltrate at night, use a drainage route, break the dungeon, and fight their way out. Serena had already calculating patrol rotations before the emotional momentum finally ran into arithmetic. Tulip territory stood beyond multiple imperial fortresses that would never ignore a northern private army crossing in peacetime. Valerius could field roughly 1,000 soldiers on ground. He knew better than any attacker. Even if 30 Iron Guards broke into the castle successfully, they would then need to escort 4 shackled civilians through hostile territory. Every checkpoint on the return route would be searching for exactly the fugitives they carried. A raid might work tactically and still destroy Greywood strategically. The Iron Guard would take losses, the southern aristocracies would see open northern aggression, and Serena's entire trade network could freeze overnight. She stopped the horses before the plan became an order. Then, she brought the problem to the one person she believed could make Valerius lose without starting the war himself. Laurian was cleaning a row of newly finished flintlock weapons when Serena entered his study without knocking. Rain still darkened her cloak, and water ran onto the floor behind her. He noted the missing knock before he noted anything else. Serena only ignored household habits when something had escaped her control. She told him Balan had been captured, his workshop seized, and his family enslaved. Laurian set the weapon down and finally connected several details Serena had hidden months earlier. The half-finished steam cylinder and pistol design she had carried south had never been only a commercial sample. She had been recruiting Balan from the beginning. Serena admitted it without wasting time on excuses. A dwarven grandmaster capable of improving Greywood's firing mechanisms on his own initiative was precisely the kind of talent their industrial system needed. Her attempt had failed badly enough to put his whole family in a dungeon. Then Serena presented the direct raid she had already rejected once and asked whether Laurian saw any way to make it work. He did not soften his answer. 30 elite troops could probably kill a remarkable number of defenders inside narrow castle corridors. That did not make the mission sensible. Assassinating one target and extracting 4 prisoners were completely different operations. The dwarves would slow every movement and the returning force would leave a trail straight back to Greywood. Laurian refused to gamble soldiers he had spent years training on a rescue with a failure probability he considered unacceptable. Balin was valuable, but he had not even sworn loyalty to Greywood yet. More important, a northern military strike would burn trust across every southern trade route Serena had spent years building. Serena asked whether the alternative was simply allowing the family to die. Laurian told her they did not need to attack Valerius with a blade at all. Self-interest was usually sharper. He walked to the wall map and asked which southern family hated Valerius enough to become useful with the correct encouragement. Serena answered immediately. The Kevins family had spent years fighting Valerius over fishing rights, trade routes, disputed waters, and border influence. Their patrol boats had disappeared in contested areas. Caravans had been obstructed, and neither house had forgiven the accumulated insults. Laurian did not need to manufacture hatred from nothing. He only needed to finance confidence. Starting the next day, the Nightingale Guild would quietly stop supplying merchants inside Tulip territory. Compass maintenance mattered most because Valerius's coastal economy depended heavily on reliable navigation. The interruption needed to feel commercially painful while leaving no obvious northern military fingerprint. At the same time, Serena would meet the Kevins patriarch in secret. She would offer an interest-free loan large enough to hire every serious mercenary band along the southern border. Greywood would also sell Kevins large quantities of steel armor and crossbows at a steep discount. Those weapons were impressive by southern standards and already sliding toward obsolescence in Greywood, now that firearms were entering regular production. Old inventory sitting in a warehouse earned nothing. Old inventory turning an existing rival into a stronger enemy of Valerius earned leverage. If Kevin suddenly possessed enough money and weapons to believe victory was possible, Laurian expected the old rivalry to escalate on its own. That was the important part. Greywood would not need to order anyone to declare war. The two southern houses already had enough unresolved grievance to do that work for free once. One side believed the balance had shifted. Valerius would be forced to pull troops toward his borders and away from the castle, protecting Balon. 1,000 soldiers facing outward could not simultaneously guard every corridor, dungeon entrance, warehouse, and road at home. Serena recognized the structure quickly and compared it to using a tiger to drive away a snake. Laurian accepted the description. His system deposited so much silver every morning that financing someone else's conflict was cheaper than exposing Greywood's own troops. The old aristocracy still measured strength in estates and inherited land. Laurian increasingly measured it in liquid capital, factories, and how quickly either could be converted into another person's decision. The plan did not end with the first battle. Eventually, either exhaustion or fear would force the southern houses toward negotiation. As the fine financier and arms supplier behind Kevin's, Serena would have earned a place near that table, without Greywood formally conquering anything. That was when Balon became the real objective again. Serena would place one deliberately insulting demand among the peace terms. Valerius would surrender the useless dwarf slaves as compensation for her earlier humiliation. Laurian emphasized both words, because pride would do part of the bargaining for them. A count like Valerius would fight far harder over land, a port, or a public concession than over craftsmen he had already branded disloyal. Calling them useless made the concession sound like contempt rather than surrender. If Valerius could keep his territory and preserve his dignity by throwing away 4 prisoners he hated, he might convince himself he had not lost anything important. That was the opening Laurian intended to buy. Serena's anger cooled as the full mechanism became visible. No iron guards needed to die, no northern crest needed to appear in an assault, and Greywood could turn outdated weapons into political leverage. More importantly, the operation attacked Valerius through assumptions he already carried, rather than trying to overpower his defenses directly. Serena straightened, recovered the composure she had lost on entering, and said she would leave for the south the next morning. Laurian gave her one final condition before she reached the door. Everything else could be negotiated according to circumstance. Balin Steel Anvil, his 2 sons, and his daughter had to come back alive. That was the only result Laurian considered non-negotiable. Greywood's mornings had become so organized that Laurian could measure the town's growth by how many problems reached his desk before breakfast. Ling and Tang had learned his routine well enough that he rarely needed to give instructions for the small things anymore. Tang opened the bedroom curtains carefully, while Ling arrived with warm water already prepared. That morning, Tang had added a little mint, hoping the scent would wake him before the day's meeting started. Laurian thanked her because attentiveness was useful. Only when the person offering it knew the effort had been noticed. Breakfast included bacon, oat bread, and rice from Greywood's own greenhouse trials. On Earth, the meal would have been ordinary. In Greywood, every grain represented irrigation, seeds, greenhouse labor, transport, storage, and months of people solving problems that had once seemed impossible. Laurian rarely looked at food without seeing the supply chain hiding behind it. Butler Bale had already arranged the morning documents on the left side of the study desk. One request covered additional reinforcement for the mall foundation, while another asked for more vulcanized rubber for the rain boot line. Laurian approved both. The silver his system supplied every morning made expenditures that would ruin an ordinary baron look almost trivial on his own accounts. That did not make him careless about where the money went. He ordered enough rubber to put finished boots on Iron Guard night patrols before the week ended. A patrolman losing speed because his feet were soaked and blistered cost more than the rubber saved by keeping him in cheap footwear. Val collected the papers and left with the quiet expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by huge numbers. Later that morning, Laurian reported to Han Yang in the backyard for the daily cultivation hour he had promised to maintain. His first key sensation had not disappeared after the original lesson. Han Yang now judged it stable enough to begin guiding the current through the meridians of Laurian's legs. The work was far less dramatic than the discovery. Most of the hour consisted of stance, breathing, correcting the knee angle, and repeating movements too slowly to impress anyone watching. By the end, Laurian's clothes were soaked with sweat, but the current inside his body felt clearer than it had several days earlier. Han Yang told him the progress had already reached a point many beginners needed most of a month to achieve. Laurian accepted the information, then immediately returned his attention to maintaining the posture correctly. Praise was useful data, not permission to become sloppy. A short wash and a brief nap restored enough energy for the afternoon inspections. Laurian's carriage now used rubber shock absorbers, another small workshop improvement that made the cement roads noticeably more comfortable. The first stop was the mall site, where scaffolding already climbed several floors above the ground. The soft, southern section had been excavated, compacted, and rebuilt according to Decker's revised foundation plan. The supervisor believed the first floor shops could be enclosed by autumn if the weather remained cooperative. Laurian reminded him that the deadline never justified shortcuts in drainage, lighting, or roof work. The mall was supposed to become the North's flagship commercial building. A flooded staircase or leaking roof during the first winter could destroy trust faster than a competing merchant ever could. From there, Laurian moved through the new product workshop, the water pipe project, and the hospital isolation ward. At the research shop, a revised casting mold promised to remove almost a full day from cannon barrel production. Laurian doubled the raw iron order before leaving. The water crew had already reached another residential block ahead of schedule. One foreign joked that Laurian would soon run pipes all the way to the wolf pens if nobody stopped him. Laurian did not reject the idea as strongly as the man probably expected. At the Northern District, Sylvie arrived with an update from the mountain program. Reinhold and the werewolf handlers had successfully drawn 3 separate gray wolf packs down using meat, whistles, and scent communication. The animals were accepting controlled contact faster than expected. Sylvie believed the first experimental Wolf Rider scout group could be ready within roughly a month. Laurian told her to keep the program quiet until it had enough numbers to matter. A weapon announced, while still fragile, gave competitors time to plan around it. He preferred outsiders to learn about the wolves on the same day they first saw riders coming over a ridge. That evening, Laurian skipped the manor dining room and ate at the steel plant canteen instead. The choice was not announced beforehand. Laurian preferred seeing a normal meal rather than a meal improved because someone had been warned the Lord was coming. Coal dust still marked sleeves and faces around the long tables when he sat down among the shift workers. Several spoons stopped halfway to mouths, and the room took an awkward moment to remember how eating worked. Conversation died almost completely when the workers realized their lord had taken a seat at the same long table. Old blacksmith Jan finally asked why Laurian had come. Laurian answered by asking how the new household water pipes were performing. The table came alive at once. One younger worker described his wife crying the first time clean water ran directly from the wall inside their home. Another said his children no longer spent part of every school morning walking to the old well with buckets. Those stories mattered because they translated infrastructure spending into hours returned to ordinary households. A water pipe never looked heroic on a budget sheet. Hundreds of families saving the same half hour every day added up to a productivity gain larger than most heroic speeches ever produced. Workers described wives who no longer carried buckets, children who stopped walking to distant wells before school, and clean water arriving through a brass valve. One man said his wife had cried the first morning water came directly from the wall. Another called Laurian something close to a god which Laurian ignored in favor of questions that produced useful answers. Were the shifts reasonable? Was the canteen food enough for a full day of steelwork? Were mall vouchers and household allowances easy to redeem? Praise cost nothing and could hide almost any operational problem. A worker who ate well, slept well, and believed his family benefited from the system was worth far more across a year than another speech about loyalty. Laurian cared about the boring answers, because boring answers predicted whether production stayed stable. The workers gradually stopped sitting rigidly around him and started complaining normally, which Laurian considered a much better sign. That night, Iron Guard and intelligence officers delivered the daily security reports in his study. A few foreign mercenaries had caused drunken trouble in Red Leaf territory, but local courts had already handled the incidents. Laurian left them at that level, instead of dragging minor problems upward, simply because he possessed the authority to interfere. The intelligence officer hesitated over the next report. The old Bohemia family residence in the capital was being divided among nobles who had moved quickly once Laurian's family lost control of it. The intelligence officer had clearly prepared to deliver the news delicately. He expected grief, anger, or at least resentment toward the people carving up the property. Laurian instead asked whether any of the new owners could turn the marble floor into a cannon barrel. When nobody answered, he considered the comparison settled. Laurian felt almost nothing. Marble floors in the capital could not forge a musket, feed a worker, or lay a pipe. Every useful structure he had built in Greywood mattered more to him than a dead family's crest, hanging over property he no longer needed. If the capital's nobility wanted to fight over inherited rooms, Laurian was happy to let them spend their energy there. By the time the last orders were signed, his legs had started reminding him about the morning cultivation session. A hot bath became less luxury than maintenance. Ling had added a faint lavender scent to the water, another detail Laurian had never requested and never asked her to stop. She worked tension from his temples, while Tang massaged the soreness from his legs. The two Foxkin had become comfortable enough around him that the room did not need conversation to feel settled. Laurian noticed the care without pretending it had no emotional effect on him. He simply refused to turn that effect into a problem requiring immediate action. Greywood demanded enough decisions already. For one quiet hour, he allowed the next report to remain unopened. The following evening, the same bath became the setting for a much less peaceful line of thought. Tang noticed the water cooling and asked whether more hot water should be brought in. Laurian told her it was unnecessary because his mind had already left the room entirely. Ling waited with towels while he mentally rebuilt the political map of the empire from the newest reports. Business following him into a bath was an old habit, and by then one nobody in the household expected to cure. News from 3 independent channels agreed that Duke Golden Lion had become unusually quiet. The Duke had once hired a 4th-tier assassin to remove Laurian, while Greywood still looked like an expendable frontier settlement. That attempt failed badly enough to teach him the difference between a target that looked weak on paper and one protected by real systems. The more important development was why Golden Lion had stopped interfering. Emperor Reynolds had pressured the Duke into taking his family's private army south to the long-running Orc front. Officially, the move was framed as loyal service to the throne. Laurian read it as a mutually useful transaction. The Emperor removed a troublesome great noble from capital politics, while Golden Lion purchased political breathing room by displaying obedience in public. The Southern War itself had dragged on for years. Orc forces still possessed enormous physical power, but imperial fortifications and battle magic were slowly turning brute strength into a wasting asset. Laurian's sources believed the Orcs were looking for a way out. If that conflict ended, Reynolds would have both hands free for internal consolidation. The Emperor was already beginning the process through decrees that looked harmless when read separately. Each decree attacked a different kind of local independence. A tax revision changed what nobles could keep. A census changed what the capital knew about their people. Military supply rules changed whether a private army could eat without imperial cooperation. Industrial inspections changed who could manufacture valuable goods without attracting central scrutiny. The genius of the sequence was that no single order looked dangerous enough to justify rebellion by itself. Tax adjustments, redistribution of noble territories, more inspections of privately produced industrial goods, a fresh population census, tighter central control over military supply. To a local noble, each decree could look like another piece of annoying paperwork. To Laurian, who had watched centralized states operate on Earth, the pattern was obvious. He had seen governments with completely different languages and histories discover the same tools because the incentives behind them were universal. Know the population, control the supply chain, standardize the courts, Make provincial power dependent on institutions the center can delay, approve, or deny. Then describe the resulting dependence as administrative order rather than conquest. First, count everyone, so the center knows exactly what resources exist and who can be taxed. Then control the supply lines so provincial armies cannot move without access to food, weapons, and transport the center can restrict. Then pull courts and administrative authority inward until disputes that once ended locally require approval from officials loyal to the throne. Wrap the process in words like fairness, efficiency, and order, and many provincial elites would help tighten the mechanism around themselves. Laurian did not consider Reynolds a unique genius for recognizing the strategy. The machine tree of empire had taught rulers the same lesson repeatedly across different worlds and centuries. What interested him was that Reynolds was using the same logic Laurian himself used on a smaller scale. The emperor pulled power inward toward the capital. Laurian pulled workers, merchants, production, and infrastructure inward toward Greywood. For the moment, the two systems ran on parallel tracks. Laurian measured how long that situation could last. If he had annexed multiple territories, rejected imperial reclamation, and built a private army near Franconia, the capital would have executed him long ago. Distance and perceived insignificance were doing more to protect Greywood than any legal argument. Across the 12 northern territories associated with him, the total population only reached roughly 300,000 people. The number would have described a respectable city in Laurian's old world. Inside this empire, it barely justified attention from ministries managing far richer regions. The North's total tax yield had historically been so poor that one productive southern estate could embarrass it in a comparison. Cold weather, distance, weak roads, and generations of low expectations had trained the capital to treat northern reports like background noise. Laurian considered that institutional boredom one of his cheapest defenses. That sounded large until Laurian compared it with the empire's real centers. Franconia alone held more than 1 million people inside the capital. The entire north could disappear into the empire's tax books as a poor and inconvenient frontier. Its agricultural yield remained low. The climate was harsh, and generations of officials had trained themselves to expect very little from it. Laurian hoped that habit of contempt survived as long as possible. Every year the ministries dismissed the North was another year Greywood could compound without serious interference. Emperor Reynolds appeared willing to tolerate Laurian as a useful border ruler, so long as he never forced the issue by formally declaring independence. Another layer of protection came from Prince Hudson, the emperor's uncle and nominal overlord of the region. Hudson's public image bordered on comedy. He drank, hosted poets, avoided administrative enthusiasm, and rarely behaved like a man trying to turn northern authority into a national power base. That made him much safer around an emperor who understood how dangerous ambitious uncles could become. Laurian suspected the performance had lasted too consistently for too many years to be accidental. Hudson had survived dangerous succession politics by cultivating an image of spectacular uselessness. He spent his public life drinking southern wine, entertaining poets, and showing almost no desire to govern beyond what etiquette demanded. Laurian suspected the laziness was far more deliberate than it looked. An emperor rarely fears an uncle who appears harmless. Competence, ambition, and an organized northern power base would be much more dangerous to Hudson personally than decades of elegant neglect. His refusal to govern aggressively created a vacuum Laurian had been filling, without either man needing to discuss the arrangement. The arrangement worked precisely because neither side forced it into a formal agreement. Hudson could continue appearing harmless, while Laurian handled problems the prince did not want attached to his own name. Laurian gained room to build, without making Hudson publicly responsible for every northern innovation. A signed treaty would have attracted more attention than their productive silence ever did. Every district Hudson ignored became another place where Greywood's roads, trade, security, or administration quietly mattered more. Laurian respected the discipline required to look useless for years, when survival depended on maintaining the performance. He also understood that no quiet arrangement lasted forever. Once the mall opened, Greywood goods reached the heartland in volume, and church-backed migration accelerated. The North would become harder to overlook. Population might double or triple within only a few years if the current momentum held. Industrial output would be even more difficult to hide than population. A ministry could ignore fog and poor soil. It would have more trouble ignoring cheap matches, reliable glass, rubber goods, steam transport, firearms, and merchants getting rich on northern trade. Laurian preferred to decide when the empire discovered the true scale of that machine. He did not want Franconia making the decision for him. Standing at the bathroom window, He looked over Greywood's lights and considered what imperial censuses failed to measure. They counted bodies. They did not count how many hours those people chose to work, because they expected the town to reward their effort. They did not measure trust between a worker and the administration maintaining his water supply. They did not record the productivity created when one district believed tomorrow would be better than last winter. Greywood's real advantage lived in those invisible inputs. To outsiders, Laurian remained an arrogant young northern lord who might rebel someday. To Reynolds, he was a useful nuisance that kept other nobles occupied without costing imperial soldiers. To Prince Hudson, he was probably still not worth interrupting a good bottle of wine. Laurian wanted all three misunderstandings preserved. His most dangerous weapon was not any single cannon. It was compound growth hidden inside a territory. Everyone had trained themselves not to inspect closely. Soon after, Greywood finished a project designed to become impossible to ignore in a completely different way. The Cathedral of Holy Light rose beside the central square under a cloudless northern sky. The white granite facing had cost far more to move than ordinary construction stone, and Laurian had approved the transport anyway. A cathedral intended to attract settlers could not look like a warehouse with a taller roof. Its visual authority was part of the recruitment function, whether priests admitted that architecture influenced faith or not. The colored windows also became a live demonstration of Greywood's newer glassmaking capability. Its cement and steel structure was faced with pale granite, while a tall spire dominated the surrounding roofs. Inside, Greywood's new colored glass workshops had filled the windows with bright religious scenes. Workers who had helped install them described the finished interior with pride that had very little to do with doctrine. The square filled early for the dedication ceremony. Human townspeople stood beside large numbers of orc laborers who had helped build the cathedral, even though imperial religion treated their kind with open suspicion. Some of the orcs copied the folded arms and solemn posture they had seen human worshippers use on Sundays. The imitation was imperfect, and therefore more revealing. They had built the structure, watched ceremonies from the outside, and learned enough of local behavior to know the morning was supposed to matter. Laurian noticed because social integration often appeared in small habits before it appeared in official declarations. Laurian paid those workers the same wage. He paid humans doing the same labor. He did not frame the policy as charity. Resentful workers produced worse construction, and Laurian had no interest in saving wages, only to buy structural problems later. Equal pay also gave the orcs a practical reason to connect Greywood with fair treatment rather than imperial prejudice. Laurian stood on the cathedral steps in formal black and silver clothes, waiting for Bishop Macbeth's carriage. He had arranged the visitor's route deliberately, so the bishop would travel through the most visibly transformed parts of town. Before reaching the square, the effect worked. When Macbeth stepped from his carriage, his practiced composure failed for several seconds. Laurian had planned the arrival route carefully. The carriage passed cement streets, brick buildings, glass storefronts, and organized patrols before ever reaching the cathedral square. Macbeth therefore encountered the scale of Greywood gradually, with each block making his old assumptions harder to preserve. By the time the cathedral appeared, surprise had already been accumulating for most of the ride. The last time he had visited, Greywood had been a rough northern settlement of timber buildings, mud, and limited public works. Now he stood on smooth cement surrounded by brick structures, glass windows, uniformed sheriffs, healthy workers, and disciplined cavalry. For a moment, the bishop looked as though he suspected his driver had taken him to the wrong city. Laurian enjoyed the reaction, because he remembered the previous balance between them very clearly. A year earlier, Greywood had needed church goodwill far more than the church needed Greywood. Laurian had paid carefully for that goodwill through gifts and regular offerings. Now Macbeth was looking at a town whose resources, population, and armed force no longer matched the weak frontier parish in his memory. Father Cantrell greeted him first, now wearing the richer robes appropriate to his elevated position. Macbeth corrected himself mid-greeting and addressed Cantrell as a bishop, acknowledging how far Greywood's local church had risen. Cantrell credited Laurian's support for the cathedral and the parish's growth. Laurian was happy to let him tell that version of the story. A grateful churchman repeating Greywood's generosity was more valuable than any public speech Laurian could give about his own intentions. As Macbeth crossed the square, his eyes kept measuring details he tried not to stare at openly. The Iron Guard cavalry bothered him most. A wild northern settlement was not supposed to field disciplined horsemen, wearing good steel and sitting their mounts with the calm of a permanent force. Macbeth also noticed the healthy faces in the crowd. Poverty could be hidden behind a new building for one ceremony. A population that looked consistently fed was much harder to fake. Iron Guard cavalry, sheriffs carrying standardized equipment, good steel, clean streets, laborers who looked fed rather than exhausted. Every item contradicted the northern poverty Macbeth had expected to find. The dedication and investiture ceremony proceeded inside the cathedral with hymns, organ music, and formal ritual. Macbeth formally elevated Cantrell before the congregation, giving Greywood a religious rank it had never possessed during the old wooden settlement years. Laurian remained in the Lord's seat through the hymns and let everyone else absorb the spiritual meaning. His own calculations focused on legitimacy, migration, and how many Southern believers would trust a bishop's recommendation over a Northern advertisement. Lortrain sat through it respectfully, while calculating what the Finnish cathedral could do for migration. Religious legitimacy mattered because millions of ordinary people trusted church recommendations more readily than noble proclamations. A frontier lord promising cheap land sounded risky. A priest telling displaced believers that a new parish offered work, worship, and protection sounded like providence. Laurian did not need to share their theology to understand the recruitment network hidden inside it. Population remained the one resource his system could not simply deposit into an account every morning. The church possessed exactly the social trust needed to move that resource across provinces. After the ceremony, Laurian and Macbeth met privately over Southern wine. The bishop had regained his manners but not his old confidence. He had arrived expecting to renegotiate from a position of religious authority. The transformed town forced him to recalculate who needed whom. Macbeth suggested that their previous financial arrangement should be updated, now that Greywood was spending so heavily on expansion. He framed the reduction as his own generosity, rather than admitting Greywood had become strong enough that the old protection arrangement looked outdated. The performance was tactful. A church official who once held the stronger position needed some graceful way to become a partner without publicly describing the change as retreat. Laurian saw no profit in denying him that dignity. He proposed reducing the monthly holy light offering from 50,000 silver coins to 30,000. The reduction was presented as church compassion for a growing but burdened frontier territory. In exchange, Macbeth offered personal help with matters Laurian might need handled in the capital. It was a polished attempt to turn an old protection payment into an alliance without admitting that the balance had changed. Laurian understood the maneuver and saw no reason to embarrass him for making it. 50,000 silver meant very little against the enormous deposits Laurian's system supplied. Macbeth had no idea how large that income really was, and Laurian intended to preserve the ignorance. A negotiator who knew Laurian's true treasury would simply ask for a larger share. Laurian stood and poured Macbeth wine himself before answering. The humble gestures softened the room and cost almost nothing. Then Laurian told the bishop the church's monthly payment would not fall at all. It would rise to 100,000 silver coins. Macbeth stared at him in complete disbelief. The bishop had prepared himself for refusal, and probably even for a cautious compromise. He had not prepared for Laurian to double the payment and make the larger number sound like the opening move rather than the concession. For several seconds, the negotiation stopped, because Macbeth was still trying to understand what game he had entered. That amount exceeded 1 million silver across a year, enough to purchase political influence at a level the bishop had never possessed. Laurian had already calculated the figure before Macbeth ever left for Greywood. He had also already decided what return he expected from it. The money was not charity. It was investment capital directed at the bishop's ambition. Duke Golden Lion was away at the southern front, and therefore less capable of shaping church politics in the capital. The capital's aging archbishop was in visibly declining health. When that seat became vacant, every serious churchman would compete to control it. Macbeth governed a remote parish and normally would have lacked both the wealth and political proof required to be taken seriously. Greywood could change both conditions. The new cathedral was visible evidence that Macbeth's northern sphere was flourishing. It gave the bishop something political money alone could not buy. He could point to a real institution, a growing congregation, and a frontier region where the church visibly expanded under his influence. The silver could finance ambition. The cathedral could make the ambition look deserved. 100,000 silver every month could finance the relationships, charitable works, travel, and favors required to make his candidacy real. Laurian told him that the empire's center needed an archbishop who understood order and prosperity. Macbeth heard the unspoken message perfectly. Laurian was offering to turn an impossible private ambition into a plausible career path. The bishop's voice changed when he finally asked what Laurian wanted in return. The answer surprised him by being much smaller than the fortune attached to it. Southern parishes were full of war refugees, bankrupt farmers, and displaced families who had lost land or employment. The North had the opposite problem. Greywood possessed work, housing projects, new farms, workshops, and territory, but not enough people to fill all of them. Laurian wanted Macbeth to use church pulpits and trust networks to guide willing displaced believers north. He did not ask for forced relocation or secret quotas. The offer needed to remain attractive enough that families chose it after hearing the conditions. Greywood could promise work, housing, land opportunities, functioning churches, and an administration already struggling to fill jobs faster than people arrived. For refugees living on uncertain charity in the South, those facts could do most of the persuasion themselves. Priests could describe the migration as relief, renewal, and a chance to rebuild under the holy light. Greywood would feed, house, and employ the arrivals, instead of leaving them dependent on parish charity. The church would gain credit for helping the poor. Macbeth would gain a visible humanitarian success and the political strength funded by Laurian's silver. Laurian would gain the labor and population required to keep his industrial expansion from choking on its own success. All three parties received something they genuinely valued. That was why Laurian believed the arrangement had a better chance of surviving than a deal built on fear alone. Macbeth accepted with real warmth once he understood the scale of what was being offered. He left the reception no longer worried about losing 20,000 silver a month. He was thinking about the archbishop's seat and the southern congregations that could become his route toward it. Laurian watched him go with equal satisfaction. The bishop believed he had found a patron capable of lifting him into the capital's highest religious circles. Laurian believed he had purchased a continent-spanning migration network for money his system would replace automatically. Neither man needed the other to lose for the agreement to work. That made the bargain stronger than most political friendships Laurian had ever seen. Somewhere far south, families who currently saw no future beyond refugee camps and failing farms were about to hear that the North needed them. They might call the opportunity the mercy of the holy light. Laurian would call it population growth, supported by a distribution network. He had been lucky enough not to build himself. Both descriptions could be true at the same time. The southern operation began with a lie designed to work, only because Count Valerius already wanted to believe it. Laurian learned the details later from Marcus's report and Serena's dispatches, neither of which he trusted without comparing them against each other. Marcus had a merchant's habit of describing his own cleverness generously. Serena had a different habit of omitting anything she considered unnecessary to the result. Where their accounts overlapped, Laurian treated the broad sequence as reliable. The Nightingale Guild stopped supplying every merchant organization still operating inside Tulip territory. Most of the missing goods were inconvenient rather than catastrophic. Compass maintenance was different. A coastal territory that depended on shipping could replace cloth or dry goods easily, but reliable navigation equipment affected routes, schedules, and risk immediately. Valerius received the report during the southern rainy season, while his patience was already being tested by weeks of gray weather. 37 merchant guilds had lost access at once. The Count reacted less to the material shortage than to what he believed the decision said about his authority. He had previously forced Serena to surrender half her compass rights and considered that punishment merciful. In his own mind, she should have remained grateful that he had not taken more. The sudden cutoff, therefore, looked like deliberate disrespect from someone he believed he had already disciplined. Valerius ordered Sir Lancelot to seize Marcus, manager of the Nightingale branch in Raging Wave City, and discover who stood behind the provocation. Lancelot entered the branch with soldiers and dragged Marcus partly across his desk by the collar. Marcus did not waste the opportunity by acting brave. He acted frightened in exactly the useful way the plan required. The guild, he insisted, had not chosen to stop trade with Tulip territory. The Kevins family had sealed a Nightingale warehouse and threatened to blacklist the guild across the regional commercial council. Marcus presented himself as a small merchant trapped between two powerful houses and obeying whichever threat stood closest. Then he added the detail designed to redirect suspicion permanently. Serena Bohemia herself was supposedly traveling south to meet the Kevins family and resolve the pressure directly. The lie landed because Lancelot already knew the history between Valerius and Kevins. Those houses had fought over fishing rights, border villages, ports, and commercial influence for years. They had traded threats often enough that one more hidden maneuver required almost no imagination. Lancelot released Marcus, warned him that a false story would cost him his legs, and left without asking the questions that might have exposed the performance. Once the soldiers disappeared, Marcus straightened his collar and returned to the tea they had interrupted. Laurian later admired the execution, despite refusing to believe every self-congratulatory detail Marcus included in the report. A branch manager capable of improvising under physical pressure was worth more than one who merely balanced accounts correctly. The important result was undeniable. Valerius now looked south toward Kevin's instead of north toward Greywood. His next decisions made the deception stronger than the original lie. Valerius tripled tolls on caravans carrying the Kevin's crest. He sent armed patrols into disputed villages with instructions to drive away Kevin tax and grain collectors. He also ordered the remaining Nightingale Guild property inside Tulip territory seized as enemy assets. Every retaliation produced fresh evidence that the houses were moving toward open conflict. At the Kevin's estate, Patriarch Kevin received the news with equal fury and a completely different interpretation. The estate itself looked like new wealth, trying very hard to resemble inherited wealth. Stone fountains lined the approach, ornamental hedges framed the gardens, and nearly every decorative choice announced that the family could afford excess. Serena found the performance slightly ridiculous, because the fortune beneath it had been built from grain, fish, shipping, and practical trade. The patriarch was a broad man, with a heavy red beard and a temper less decorative than his gardens. One report claimed he damaged his own desk after hearing that another caravan had been detained. A rent collector being driven from a disputed road offended him almost as much as the financial loss, because it made the humiliation personal. Several family caravans were detained on invented smuggling charges. One of his collectors had been chased from a border road by Tulip cavalry. The patriarch concluded that Valerius had wanted a confrontation already and was using the guild dispute as an excuse. That conclusion was wrong in detail and useful in every practical respect. Kevin's officers proposed retaliatory tariffs, port restrictions, grain speculation, and petitions to the Southern Parliament. One officer wanted every Tulip cargo blocked from Kevin's controlled ports. Another proposed buying enough grain futures to squeeze Valerius's vassals before winter. A third suggested taking the matter to the Southern Parliament, which produced cynical reactions from men who believed Parliament usually followed whoever could spend more money on persuasion. The variety of ideas hid the same weakness. Every proposal repeated the old rivalry's pattern instead of changing the balance behind it. None of those ideas broke the old pattern. The houses had spent years trading commercial injuries without gaining enough advantage to end the rivalry. The meeting was still circling around another round of expensive stalemate when a servant announced Serena's arrival. Patriarch Kevin found the timing almost insulting. The woman whose guild appeared connected to the entire mess had delivered herself to his door, while his officers were still arguing about the damage. Curiosity defeated caution. He ordered Serena brought directly into the study. She entered in a dark traveling dress and carried herself with a steadiness that had not existed when Laurian first sent her into Southern politics. Months of hostile negotiations had sharpened her without stripping away the manners she had been raised to use. She offered the formal greeting appropriate to the patriarch's rank. He cut through the courtesy almost immediately. Kevin blamed the Nightingale Guild's incompetence for giving Valerius an excuse to attack his caravans. He warned Serena that the family would not shelter her simply because her own business had become unsafe. Serena told him she had not come asking for protection. She removed her traveling cloak without hurry and allowed the insult to remain unanswered. The refusal to defend her pride did more to unsettle the room than an angry response would have. Serena admitted that the Nightingale Guild alone lacked the power to promise Valerius's removal. Then she separated the guild from what stood behind it. Greywood's workshops ran through the night. Its roads connected territory faster than southern nobles expected, and its treasury no longer behaved like that of a frontier barony. She was not asking Kevin to believe a story about northern potential. She had brought samples of the potential with her. She represented Laurian Bohemia in the northern territories. More importantly, she had come with a way to remove Valerius as a long-term threat instead of trading another season of tariffs with him. Patriarch Kevin mocked the claim. A guild that could not protect its own branches hardly looked qualified to promise the destruction of an established count. He also reminded Serena of her earlier humiliation at the White Gold Tavern. Anger, he told her, was not the same thing as power. Serena agreed with the first part, instead of defending her pride. The Nightingale Guild by itself was not powerful enough. What stood behind the guild was. Greywood now produced wealth, weapons, and machinery at a scale the South had never seen from the North. Serena clapped once toward the door. 4 iron guards entered, carrying 2 heavy wooden crates reinforced with black metal. The first struck the carpet with enough weight to stop every conversation in the room. The smell of protective oil reached the officers before anyone touched the contents. Clean steel armor and blue-polished bolts were packed with a degree of standardization that made the crate feel less like a noble's armory and more like inventory. That distinction was unfamiliar in the South. High-quality armor usually arrived as individual work from expensive craftsmen, not as something a distant territory appeared ready to ship by the crate. Serena opened it and exposed stacks of steel half-armor beside polished armor-piercing crossbow bolts. Southern officers moved closer immediately. Even wealthy private armies still relied heavily on iron, leather, and small numbers of expensive steel pieces. Greywood's standardized forging made the contents look like elite equipment prepared for mass issue. One officer tested the edge of a bolt and cut his thumb before he realized how sharp it was. Serena called the crate only a sign of sincerity. That description mattered because Greywood was already treating much of the equipment as older inventory. Muskets were pushing crossbows out of Laurian's preferred frontline doctrine. Better firearms would eventually make even excellent steel armor less decisive. Selling those older technologies South converted warehouse stock into influence before it lost more military value. Serena then put the financial offer on the table. Greywood would provide an interest-free loan, large enough for Kevins to hire the available mercenary forces along the southern frontier. The family could also purchase continuing shipments of armor, crossbows, and related equipment at roughly 30% below normal market prices. The offer had no hidden demand for Kevin territory and no repayment schedule designed to seize property after a loss. It was a subsidy intended to change the balance of the conflict. Patriarch Kevin's officers stopped treating Serena like a humiliated merchant almost immediately. They began listening to her like a supplier who could determine whether their next war was affordable. Kevin asked the obvious question. Was Greywood really spending this much simply because Serena disliked Valerius? Serena answered with Laurian's reasoning. Greywood did not need revenge for one insult badly enough to finance a war. It needed a southern commercial order that did not let one arrogant count block routes, seize guild property, or dictate terms whenever he became irritated. Valerius was dangerous because he could turn private pride into regional disruption. Removing that leverage benefited every merchant network Greywood planned to use in the future. The Kevins family benefited for a more personal reason. It could finally settle a rivalry that had consumed money and attention for years. Patriarch Kevin remained suspicious because generosity at this scale was rarely generosity. Before accepting the purpose, he listed the costs Serena's plan could spread across the region. A long war would disrupt harvests, shipping lanes, minor border lords, and every merchant forced to guess which road remained safe. He asked whether Greywood intended to send its own army south, because that would transform a private rivalry into obvious northern intervention against imperial interests. Serena said no. The North intended to change the terms of the fight without becoming the mass of bodies fighting it. Serena did not ask him to trust her motives. She asked him to calculate whether the offer improved his position. That was a language both sides understood. The Patriarch wanted proof that Greywood could offer more than familiar steel weapons. Serena opened the second crate. Inside lay flintlock muskets, powder equipment, and standardized ammunition packed for demonstration. The room changed again. Most of the southern officers had heard rumors about northern firearms, but rumors had not prepared them for a weapon built in repeating workshop batches. Serena took the group outside, where 10 Iron Guard musketeers were already waiting. The estate training ground had been prepared in advance, because Serena never intended to explain the new weapon only across a desk. 3 scarecrows wearing standard southern plate stood at the far end. The armor was good enough to survive ordinary crossbow fire from ranges many officers considered dangerous. Kevin and his senior men stayed well back, still treating the strange metal tubes as curiosities rather than immediate threats. The absence of a bowstring, visible magical crystal, or bladed edge made the weapon difficult for them to classify. Armored scarecrows stood downrange at roughly 60 paces. Their breastplates represented the kind of protection a wealthy southern household might issue to good soldiers. At Serena's signal, the musketeers raised their weapons together. The loading sequence had already started to disturb the observers before the shot. Each soldier tore open a measured powder charge, poured it down the barrel, seated a lead ball, and drove the load home with a ramrod. 10 men moved through the process at nearly the same rhythm. There was no spectacular strength in the motion and no magical concentration to admire, only drilled repetition. That lack of visible expertise bothered the officers because it suggested the weapon's effectiveness did not depend on producing another rare elite warrior. The volley arrived as one violent crack, followed by powder smoke rolling across the field. When the targets were examined, the armor was punched through repeatedly. The damage was uglier at close range than the smoke had suggested. Metal had folded inward around ragged holes. Straw stuffing lay scattered behind the targets, and one damaged section of the mock armor hung by its straps. A senior officer quietly asked what the same impact would do to a living body trapped inside the plate. Nobody needed Serena to answer. The scarecrows behind it had been torn open where bolts and ordinary arrows would often have been stopped or deflected. Patriarch Kevin asked how long such soldiers needed to train. The answer was more threatening than the damage itself. A musket user did not need the lifetime of sword conditioning required to become an elite knight. Formation discipline, loading practice, and reliable nerve mattered more than noble blood or exceptional physical talent. Enough ordinary men could be turned into useful firearm troops within a practical training cycle. That meant the weapon changed not only battlefield range, but the economics of producing military power. For Southern aristocrats, military status had always been tied to the time required to create an effective fighter. A noble-born knight represented years of food, tutors, weapons, horses, and physical conditioning. The musket threatened that investment model because the mechanical advantage sat inside the weapon and the formation as much as inside the person carrying it. One officer described the change in the simplest possible way. The distance between a farmer and a knight had narrowed to the pull of a trigger. Risna then described Greywood's artillery. Kevin's reaction to the cannon description was more serious than his reaction to the muskets. Armor could be replaced. Castle walls and mage shields were supposed to be the final layer that made wealthy houses safe from ordinary violence. Serena told him, a cannon threw solid iron shot across hundreds of paces and could batter a reinforced gate without asking permission from the defender's doctrine. Even magical shielding could be exhausted if enough physical energy struck it repeatedly. Cannons could reach fortifications from distances where ordinary bows and most field magic had limited influence. A gate, tower, or shield formation that expected a close siege could be attacked before defenders believed the real battle had started. Kevin's officers wanted the cannons immediately. Serena refused to pretend they could simply be handed over like spare crossbows. Artillery required trained crews, powder logistics, maintenance, and people who understood how to aim without killing their own side. Greywood could provide a small number of weapons and instructors, but the South still needed to supply the mass of soldiers. That became the basic division of labor. Kevin's would provide its private troops, money management, local intelligence, and the political banner under which the war would actually be fought. Greywood would provide financing, discounted armor, firearms, limited artillery, and technical instruction. Laurian's people would not march south as a conquering northern army. The distinction mattered strategically and diplomatically. Patriarch Kevin asked the question Serena had expected eventually. His fear was no longer that Greywood exaggerated its strength. It was that Greywood had told the truth. A weak supplier could be ignored after a war. A supplier holding weapons capable of rewriting night warfare had to be considered in every future political calculation. If Greywood could arm him this way today, what stopped Laurian from arming his enemies tomorrow? Nothing physical stopped him. Serena did not insult the patriarch by pretending otherwise. She argued instead that Laurian had no reason to conquer southern land when Greywood's factories were hundreds of miles away, and the North desperately needed trade rather than another occupation problem. Customers were more profitable than subjects in territory. Laurian had no desire to administer directly. A stable Kevin's commercial network could buy northern goods for years. A ruined South could not. That answer did not remove the risk. It made the risk rational enough for ambition to beat caution. Patriarch Kevin had spent too many years watching Valerius block his expansion to ignore a chance this large. He agreed to continue the alliance and begin raising troops under the terms Serena presented. Serena pressed the final choice, where ambition already hurt most. Kevin's could remain squeezed between larger powers for another generation, fighting the same trade arguments with the same limited tools. Or it could use this opening to seize ports, council's influence, in a position no rival would voluntarily hand over later. The patriarch closed his eyes long enough to make the decision visible before he extended his hand. He ordered immediate mustering and accepted Serena's demand that the border be burning within weeks, not months. The transformation from merchant quarrel to military campaign had happened without one Greywood soldier crossing the border in anger. Laurian later considered that the first real proof that the proxy strategy was functioning. The war still needed people willing to fight it. Kevin's had a private army, but not enough trained troops to overwhelm Tulip territory by itself. The missing mass would come from mercenaries. Recruitment notices appeared across southern guild halls, offering wages high enough to sound suspicious. Ordinary guards could earn 50 silver coins per week. First-tier fighters were offered 1 gold coin, while second-tier combatants could earn 3 gold or more depending on reputation. Half a month's pay was available in advance. Contracts were short enough to attract men who would never swear permanent service to a noble family. The exact target remained secret during recruitment. Applicants only knew that Kevin's family was preparing a major operation and had money to spend. That secrecy produced suspicion among experienced mercenaries. One older one-eyed swordsman openly asked why anyone would pay such rates without naming the battlefield. The recruiters answered with coin rather than explanation. Men, unwilling to accept the uncertainty, could walk away before signing. Enough stayed. Within days, the temporary camp grew into a disorderly town of tents, cookfires, weapon racks, gamblers, camp followers, and hired specialists. Dozens more arrived almost every day. There were young fighters chasing their first serious contract, veterans with scars from border wars, and wandering second-tier warriors whose skills normally made local nobles negotiate carefully. 4 mages also joined under separate arrangements, valuable enough that their quarters were kept away from the common camp. The total pushed past 1,000 hired fighters before the recruiters stopped accepting everyone who appeared with a weapon. A few brought wives and children to the camp boundary, because 3 months of dangerous work still required someone to wait for the promised pay. Serena included those families in her report without commentary. The detail mattered anyway, because it exposed the difference between a troop count and the human weight attached to it. The assembly area outside Kevin's territory expanded into a fenced tent settlement faster than quartermasters had planned. New rows were added almost every morning because the previous night's arrivals had already consumed the available space. Cook fires burned at all hours. Supply wagons clogged nearby roads. Cooks worked in shifts because 1,000 armed men did not stop needing meals, simply because officers were still counting them. The smell of stew, horses, damp leather, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies settled over the surrounding farms. Villagers discovered that a military camp could be an annoyance and a market at the same time. Boot repair, food, drink, laundry, and cheap entertainment all found customers among men carrying advance pay. Nearby farmers complained about the noise, while quietly raising the price of eggs. Serena's estimates placed daily arrivals in the dozens even after the first surge. The camp never became silent at night. Dice games, arguments, hammering, animals, and men returning from latrines created a low continuous sound across the field. The one-eyed swordsman from the original guild hall eventually appeared in the camp as well. He spent evenings sharpening a great sword beside the same fire and rubbing the old scar around his missing eye when the noise grew too strange. The advance payment remained in his pocket. So did the instinct telling him that nobody offered this much money for a harmless assignment. He joked that the gathered force looked large enough to fight a dragon. The joke carried more concern than confidence. Men like him were exactly why Serena expected the target reveal to be dangerous. Veterans knew that large pay and large armies usually existed because the employer had found a problem capable of killing both. Laurian understood the weakness immediately when Serena reported the number. Money had purchased bodies. It had not purchased discipline. 1,000 independent fighters still behave like 1,000 individual businesses, sharing the same field. They argued over food, gambling debts, tent space, and which companies deserved the safer positions. Some drank heavily because nobody had yet given them a reason not to. Recruits entering the secured camp were not allowed to leave again before the operation began. The rule generated complaints, but the signing bonus had been collected before most men started thinking carefully about what the closed gate implied. A locked camp also prevented Valerius's agents from learning the final target through ordinary tavern gossip. Serena assumed spies were already trying. She simply wanted each piece of information to cost them more time. Kevin's quartermasters began separating companies by approximate skill, preferred weapons, and whether they already had an internal leader people would follow. That organizational work looked mundane beside the weapon demonstrations. It was also the only way to turn a headcount above 1,000 into anything that could receive an order coherently. Serena sent Laurian more numbers than stories during this stage. How many fighters had arrived? How many possessed real armor? How many horses were available? How many companies could march without reorganizing? How many days of grain the camp held if roads became muddy again? Laurian cared about those figures more than colorful descriptions of dangerous men around fires. An army failed from shortages just as reliably as from enemy steel. He authorized more capital whenever the supply projections became thin. The system replaced silver faster than the South, could convert it into grain, tents, and wages. That imbalance was one of Laurian's largest advantages and one of his most carefully protected secrets. Valerius could see the visible army growing. He could not see the financial machine underneath it, and therefore could not estimate how long the pressure could be sustained. That problem would need to be solved before the target was revealed. While the southern recruitment notices spread, Laurian's own evening in Greywood remained almost aggressively ordinary. The Iron Guard Intelligence Digest arrived beside production reports and agricultural requests, instead on some ceremonial war table. 6 werewolf scouts had been added to the reserve and were already learning tracking work across broken northern terrain. That line required only a signature, because the handlers had solved the practical problems without waiting for Laurian to interfere. A tannery dispute over shift scheduling had also been settled before reaching him. Laurian preferred problems to arrive in that condition whenever possible. An administration that needed its ruler to mediate every argument was not an administration, only a queue outside one man's door. The third blast furnace at the steel plant had fired successfully. Refined output was projected to climb by roughly 15% once the new furnace reached stable operation. Li Jinshu's first experimental rice crop had entered the heading stage, and the irrigation budget beneath it needed approval. Lorchen signed the water request, without pretending agricultural expertise mattered more than the specialists already managing the field. His system's daily silver deposit registered quietly at the edge of his awareness during the same review. That income was the hidden fuel behind a southern war whose soldiers did not know Laurian's name mattered to their pay. The old nobility measured military preparation by how much tax a province could squeeze from land before peasants broke. Laurian could inject capital without first stripping it from the villages expected to survive the campaign. That difference made a long list of options possible that Valerius would never think to price correctly. Laurian did not care which southern family controlled which muddy border village after the fighting ended. The real objective was extracting technical knowledge from an aristocratic system that had trapped it in decorative service. Balin Steel Anvil and his family represented forging experience older than several human political disputes surrounding them. A craftsman like Balin would not abandon decades of pride and reputation simply because another patron offered a larger bag of coins. His environment had to become intolerable enough that leaving stopped feeling like surrender. Valerius had already supplied the dungeon. The proxy war would supply the rest of the pressure. Butler Bal entered later with a pigeon letter sealed in Serena's wax. The agreement with the Kevins family was confirmed. An open war could begin once recruitment and supply preparations were complete. Laurian set the message beside the other reports, rather than celebrating. The result was good because it moved the mechanism forward. It was not yet the result he actually wanted. Outside his window, workshop lights remained burning in uneven rows after dark. Some night's crew was probably repairing the latest failure from the new furnace, while southern nobles prepared to kill each other over prestige. Laurian found the contrast more reassuring than any military dispatch. A border victory could be reversed next season. A manufacturing base that learned from failure became harder to reverse every month it survived. Laurian also kept studying the military implications of the weapons Serena had shown the Kevins family. A musket did more than pierce armor. It rewrote the value of the training behind that armor. A noble could spend years and enormous resources producing one accomplished heavy fighter. A disciplined line of ordinary soldiers with firearms could threaten that investment from outside sword range. Cannons pushed the same logic further against walls, towers, gates, and concentrated formations. The South still organized war around the assumption that exceptional individuals and fortified positions set the rules. Greywood's workshops were beginning to price those assumptions out of the market. Laurian did not believe firearms made knights or mages irrelevant overnight. Powerful individuals could still kill ordinary soldiers quickly, and early firearms remained slow, dirty, and demanding to maintain. But the direction of the change was obvious. Every improvement in boring, powder quality, standardized parts, and drilling shifted another percentage of military value away from inherited talent. That was the deeper reason Balan mattered. A grandmaster fascinated by steam and mechanical precision could accelerate the workshop processes, making that transition possible. One talented dwarf was not worth sacrificing Greywood's army in a direct raid. He was absolutely worth manipulating an existing southern rivalry until someone else opened the dungeon for them. Serenus understood the same equation by then. Her reports stopped reading like those of a merchant reluctantly borrowing Laurian's methods. They increasingly sounded like someone who had learned to look for the hidden incentive before deciding where to apply pressure. The next stage would test whether money and technology could turn a camp full of mercenaries into something Valerius reasoned to fear. The mercenary camp only became dangerous in a useful way after Serena finally told the men what they had been hired to attack. Until then, high wages had kept curiosity under control better than any speech could have. The moment Tulip territory was named, that control almost disappeared. The truth was announced from a wooden platform outside the command tent after weeks of rumors had filled the information vacuum. Some recruits had convinced themselves they were being sent towards sea monsters, while others imagined an expedition into the abyss. Neither rumor frightened them as much as the real destination, because both imaginary missions lacked a fortified earl waiting behind walls. More than 1,000 armed men packed the ground below the platform, while Patriarch Kevin and Serena stood above them. The noise became so heavy that a third-tier guard commander released battle aura into the air, simply to force the crowd quiet enough to hear. Then the Patriarch told them they would break camp within 3 days and march directly against Tulip territory. For one suspended moment, the field went completely still. The first sound afterward was not cheering but curses and weapons shifting into ready hands. The one-eyed swordsman near the front drove his sharpening stone into the mud and shouted that no guard contract covered being fed to an earl's knights. His accusation moved through the crowd faster than any officer could answer it. Experienced fighters knew Count Valerius's reputation, his fortified capital, and the size of the private army he could field on home ground. Men who had accepted mystery for 50 silver a week suddenly remembered that dying made future wages difficult to collect. Arguments spread through the camp faster than the officers could contain them. Several companies demanded their advance money and threatened to leave before the march began. Others accused the Kevins family of hiding the target precisely because nobody sensible would have signed otherwise. The one-eyed swordsman who had questioned the contract from the beginning stood with the expression of a man pleased that suspicion had finally been vindicated. Serena did not try to outshout 1,000 frightened mercenaries. Patriarch Kevin visibly lost color as the front ranks pressed closer to the platform. Serena stepped forward before fear on the command side became visible enough to strengthen the riot. At her signal, curtains beside the platform were pulled away, revealing 10 disciplined Greywood musketeers and the bronze cannon hidden behind them. The contrast mattered immediately. The mercenaries below were a forest of mismatched weapons and independent tempers. The Iron Guard detachment stood so still that their silence looked like another piece of equipment. She ordered the Iron Guard demonstration team to prepare the weapon that mattered more than her explanation. A cannon was hauled into position near the edge of the camp. Most of the mercenaries had seen siege engines before. Very few had seen a compact iron tube expected to attack a structure from several hundred paces away. A disused watchtower stood roughly 500 paces downrange, far enough that ordinary bows looked almost insulting by comparison. Serena waited until the complaints had quieted enough for curiosity to replace them. Then the cannon crew loaded powder, rammed the charge, seated the ball, and checked the angle with the deliberate rhythm of men who had repeated the process many times. The mercenaries watched every movement. Some laughed at how small the crew looked beside the distance to the target. Others recognized the discipline in the loading sequence and stopped laughing early. The gunner touched flame to the vent. Before the cannon demonstration, Serena had one musketeer fire a single blank shot into the open air. The crack made the nearest rows flinch together and bought her another clean stretch of silence. She used it to name the fear directly, instead of insulting anyone for feeling it. Valerius possessed armored cavalry and disciplined infantry, and every mercenary present knew what those forces could do to a loose charge. Serena's answer was that the coming battle would not begin at sword range. The cannon fired with a concussion that rolled through the camp and sent nearby horses jerking against their reins. Smoke swallowed the weapon for a moment. Downrange, the ball struck the watchtower, hard enough to tear masonry outward, and collapse part of the upper structure. The sound of the impact reached the camp a fraction after the flash. Nobody needed Serena to explain what that meant for a wooden gate or a crowded defensive platform. Even the hired mages rose from their separate position to study the ruined tower. They could sense no elemental signature in the shot, no fire spell, no earth manipulation, and no long incantation behind the destruction. Matching that physical damage with conventional magic would have required a powerful caster and far more preparation than the gun crew had shown. For men who priced destructive power by mana, rank, and casting difficulty, the cannon did not fit the arithmetic they understood. That confusion made the weapon more frightening than its smoke. The mercenaries who had been shouting about desertion began asking different questions. How many cannons were available? How much ammunition could they carry? Could the guns break Tulip's main gate before the defenders closed range? Could they fire against night formations? Fear had not vanished. It had been repriced. A battle that sounded suicidal when described as mercenaries storming Valerius's fortress now sounded like mercenaries advancing behind weapons that might damage the fortress first. Serena told them Greywood's firearms would open the path, but no machine could walk through a broken gate on their behalf. She reframed their role in deliberately mercenary terms. They were not being paid to defeat Valerius's walls with their bodies. They were being paid to follow the guns through whatever openings the guns created and collect a victory bonus afterward. Going home rich enough to boast about helping crush an earl sounded very different from dying anonymously under a knight's horse. Their contracts still required them to fight. The difference was that they would not be asked to solve every problem with their own bodies. That was enough to turn open revolt into greed again. Men who had been preparing to leave started calculating the promised bonuses against the possibility that artillery could make the campaign easier than its reputation suggested. Serena did not trust the change in mood. A mercenary who stayed because victory suddenly looked profitable could reverse the decision just as quickly if the first charge went badly. She therefore added a second layer of discipline that the camp did not hear about immediately. 300 loyal Kevin soldiers would form behind the hired companies during the advance. Those men would carry muskets once training was complete. Their first responsibility was not attacking Tulip's line. It was preventing mass desertion from collapsing Kevin's formation at the worst possible moment. Any mercenary company that broke and ran without orders would discover that the safest direction on the battlefield was no longer automatically backward. Patriarch Kevin understood the reputational cost of that arrangement better than Serena did. If Southern guilds learned that his house had shot hired men in the back, future recruitment could become far more expensive. He weighed that future damage against the ports, trade influence, and political position available if Valerius fell. 300 loyal firearm troops behind more than 1,000 mercenaries was an ugly ratio. But the Patriarch chose the immediate prize. Patriarch Kevin disliked the implication at first. He had hired the mercenaries because he needed additional fighters, not because he wanted to execute expensive labor from behind. Serena reminded him that 1,000 independent contracts were only useful if the people signing them believed the contracts still mattered once arrows started falling. A controlled threat behind the line protected the rest of the army from one panicked company, turning retreat into contagion. Kevin accepted the logic. The rear formation also gave his own loyal soldiers a simple battlefield role, while the new firearm drills were still becoming familiar. Training consumed the next month. Kevin initially wanted to march, while the cannon demonstration still had everyone excited. Serena stopped him with the less glamorous facts of firearm logistics. Only around 30 muskets had traveled south with the initial technical party. Maintaining useful battlefield fire required roughly twice that number of trained soldiers, rotating through shooting and loading roles. The cannons were even less forgiving, because a wrong powder charge or bad range estimate could turn the weapon against its own crew. The 3-month contract had been written with training time in mind, not because Serena expected the war itself to last exactly that long. Greywood had not sent enough muskets to arm every mercenary, and Serena had never intended to. The early firearms were too valuable. Ammunition production was still limited, and untrained hands would waste both. Only a few dozen muskets were available initially. Iron Guard instructors therefore focused on building rotating crews and teaching loading discipline to selected Kevin soldiers. The goal was roughly 60 men capable of maintaining fire in organized groups while others reloaded. Every step had to become automatic. Measure powder, pour the charge, seat the ball and patch, ram it firmly, prime the pan, keep the muzzle away from the soldier beside you. Do not fire because another man fired early. Do not stare at the enemy and forget the loading sequence. The rules looked simple until frightened recruits tried performing them, while officers shouted and smoke covered the field. Iron Guard trainers made them repeat the motions until hands moved before thought. Other instructors attacked the mercenaries' individual habits directly. Men who had survived for years by trusting personal instinct were sorted by height, weapon type, and company, then forced to move on drum and horn signals. They learned which foot moved first when a shield line stopped, and how far one man could drift before he opened a hole for everyone beside him. Grown fighters who had never obeyed anyone without negotiating the price hated the process. That hatred was exactly why the process needed a full month instead of a motivational speech. Serenus also had the cannon crews drill separately. Artillery mistakes were too expensive to correct through experience after the battle started. A bad powder charge could burst a piece. A careless rammer could lose a hand. Poor alignment could put a ball through friendly troops instead of a wall. The gunners practiced distances, elevation changes, ammunition handling, and rapid repositioning under supervision. Mercenary officers were forced to learn where not to stand when the guns fired. That lesson became popular after the first man ignored the warning and spent the afternoon unable to hear properly. Discipline among the hired fighters required different tools. Serena divided the camp into smaller companies with named leaders and made food distribution depend on organized reporting rather than whoever reached the wagon first. A company that could not account for its men waited longer for pay. A company that kept weapons maintained and followed. Camp rules moved faster through supply lines. The administrative pressure annoyed them. It also worked. When several ringleaders tried to turn a pay dispute into open mutiny, The response was deliberately public. The men responsible were executed in front of the assembled companies after the evidence and orders were read aloud. Serena did not pretend the punishment was gentle. A campaign held together by contracts could not survive if armed men learned that collective intimidation always produced a better deal. The executions frightened the camp. Reward changed the mood afterward. Companies that performed well in drills received small gold bonuses, better meat, roasted ribs, butter, and extra ale under controlled distribution. Laurian would have recognized the structure immediately. Punishment defined the boundary. Reward taught everyone where profit existed inside it. The mercenaries began competing over drill scores because discipline had become another way to earn money and comfort. By the final weeks, some companies were repeating marching cadences without officers prompting them. Veterans who once mocked formation practice started punishing sloppy spacing themselves because one careless recruit could cost the whole group its reward. Greywood absorbed the additional wages, food bonuses, and ammunition without forcing Serena to slow the program for lack of cash. The ability to keep paying while men trained instead of producing immediate results was another advantage Valerius could not see from his intelligence reports. Veterans who had mocked formation training started correcting younger fighters when sloppy movement threatened the company's reward. Camp officers discovered that greed could enforce rules almost as effectively as fear when both pointed in the same direction. The one-eyed swordsman became one of the more useful examples. He still complained about nearly everything. He also kept his company organized, attended every weapons briefing, and made sure his men knew exactly where the cannon lanes would be during an advance. Serena preferred a professional complainer who followed orders to an enthusiastic fool who misunderstood them. The 4 hired mages trained with the formation only when their role required it. They were not asked to replace artillery or stand in the front rank, proving how impressive magic could look. Their task was support, countering hostile spells, breaking specific obstacles, and exploiting openings after the guns created them. That limitation offended one of them until an Iron Guard officer asked whether Pride would repair a cannon if a stray spell hit the powder carts. The mage stopped arguing. Supply became its own campaign. Thousands of fighters meant grain, meat, salt tents, arrows, medicine, lamp oil, powder, shot, spare bowstrings, horseshoes, and endless water barrels. The Kevin's family had money, but money did not become food unless someone had purchased the food before the army became hungry. Serena pushed quartermasters harder than she pushed most combat officers. A soldier who missed 1 meal complained. 1,000 soldiers who missed 2 meals started deciding whether the commander deserved obedience. Greywood's influence showed most clearly in the insistence on records. Every wagon was logged. Powder was counted by issue and return. Damaged muskets were tagged instead of disappearing into private tents. Companies signed for rations rather than helping themselves from open stores. Mercenaries who had spent years fighting under nobles with chaotic supply lines found the bureaucracy irritating right up until they realized food arrived on time. Patriarch Kevin watched the camp change and gradually understood that the North's real military advantage was not limited to firearms. The same obsession with systems that built Laurian's roads was being applied to an army that had not existed a month earlier. Serena never claimed the force had become equal to Greywood's Iron Guard. It had not. The hired companies still lacked shared history, loyalty, and the reflexive trust of soldiers who trained together for years. But they no longer looked like a festival crowd carrying swords. By the end of the month, they could march, deploy, receive rations, and advance without each company inventing its own plan. That was enough for the operation Laurian had designed. Information about the growing force inevitably reached Tulip territory. Valerius's scouts reported more than 1,000 mercenaries gathering under Kevin's money. His intelligence chief delivered the estimate in writing while the count sat comfortably beside his own fireplace. Valerius read the page once and threw it away. To him, the number proved that Kevin's was spending recklessly rather than preparing intelligently. He described mercenaries as hyenas, whose loyalty lasted only until somebody offered more coin or the fighting became unpleasant. A family enriched through fish, shipping, and trade had no business challenging an old earldom, he insisted. They reported mages, large shipments of armor, and unusual northern equipment arriving under guard. Valerius still refused to treat the army as a serious invasion threat. His arrogance supplied exactly the blind spot Laurian had expected to exploit. To Valerius, mercenaries were hyenas. They fought for coin, ran when the killing became expensive, and could not equal troops defending their own homes. That assessment was not entirely wrong. It was simply incomplete now that Serena had built structures around the usual weaknesses. Valerius also trusted Tulip's fortifications. His capital had strong walls, towers, trained heavy troops, and enough mages to make a conventional assault extremely costly. Generations of local warfare had taught him what those defenses could survive. None of those generations had included Greywood cannon. His intelligence reports mentioned strange weapons, but the Count interpreted them through categories he already understood. A loud projectile weapon became another expensive alchemical device. Muskets became awkward crossbows that used smoke. He assumed anything that powerful must be rare, difficult to operate, and impossible to sustain for long. That assumption let him explain away every warning without changing the defensive plan. Valerius refused to request outside reinforcements. His officers were ordered to maintain routine border vigilance and wait for the financial burden to break Kevin's first. Calling in extra men would have admitted that the recruitment frightened him and would also have increased the cost of feeding his own defense. Valerius expected the hired army to collapse under wages, rations, and internal disorder before it ever became a real siege force. He had no way to know the money paying those bills originated from a system that replaced Laurian's silver every morning. Calling for help before Kevin's even crossed the border would mean admitting publicly that a merchant family frightened him. Pride made the decision easier than strategy should have allowed. He ordered more patrols instead and prepared to crush the hired army once it entered Tulip Land. The same pride also shaped his treatment of Balon. The dwarf and his family remained in the dungeon as proof that disobedience would be punished. Valerius never seriously considered moving them somewhere safer. From his perspective, the castle was the safest place in the territory already. That fixed the rescue objective exactly where Laurian wanted it. If the army pulled Valerius's soldiers toward the front, and the capital became unstable, Serena would know where the prisoners still were. Greywood's werewolf intelligence continued feeding small updates back north. Laurian followed the progress without attempting to command every southern detail remotely. Serena knew the local personalities better by then. The Kevin's family understood its own roads and political limits. Laurian's job was to judge whether the operation still served the original objective, rather than proving he could micromanage it from hundreds of miles away. He continued cultivation each morning, while the mercenaries drilled in the south. Han Young gradually taught him to move the warm current through the legs, without losing his breathing rhythm. Progress remained strangely fast, but Laurian refused to let the novelty consume the schedule. 1 hour ended when the hour ended. After that came workshops, roads, budgets, population reports, and weapons orders. The contrast amused Han Yong more than it amused Laurian. A martial teacher who believed he had found a once-in-generations talent now spent every morning watching that talent leave practice early for meetings about drainage. Laurian considered the drainage more urgent. Key might save his life once. A functioning sewer saved thousands of people from disease every season. Both mattered, and only one required him to pretend personal glory belonged at the top of the ledger. By the time Serena sent word that the army was ready to move, Greywood had already advanced several unrelated projects. The first Wolf Riders were nearing useful scouting drills. Steam transport was carrying more regular freight. The mall structure was climbing above its foundations. Match sales suggested repeat household demand strong enough to justify more production. Those developments mattered because they proved the Southern campaign had not become the entire story of Greywood. Laurian wanted Balon as an addition to an expanding machine, not as the excuse for that machine to stop. In the south, the camp broke formation for the final time before departure, only long enough for paymasters to settle advances and quartermasters to load wagons. Kevin's fielded roughly 800 of its own soldiers for the invasion. More than 1,000 mercenaries marched beside them. The force included the selected firearm troops, artillery crews, hired mages, medical wagons, and enough food to keep the column moving without stripping every village it passed. That last restriction came directly from Serena. An army supposedly fighting to improve the Southern trade order could not begin by robbing every farmer on its own route. Mercenary companies grumbled when officers stopped them from taking livestock freely. They grumbled less after learning the quartermasters were paying for fresh meat instead. He understood that a purchased chicken cost almost nothing compared with the intelligence and local cooperation lost when soldiers stole it. Patriarch Kevin remained behind the main operational line long enough to handle the political consequences if the campaign failed. His commanders carried the family's banner forward. Serena traveled with the force because the artillery and firearm units still needed someone who understood what Greywood wanted from them. She was also protecting the hidden objective. Most of the army believed the campaign existed to defeat Valerius. Only a small number of people knew that Laurian measured success partly by whether 4 dwarves left the dungeon alive. That secrecy mattered. If Balin's name became public too early, Valerius might recognize the prisoners as leverage rather than worthless slaves. As long as he believed the war was about Kevin's ambition and old commercial grudges, he had little reason to use them strategically. The invading army reached the Blackwater crossing under weather, clear enough that scouts could see movement across the open ground. When the month ended, roughly 800 Kevins, private soldiers, crossed with the mercenary host instead of waiting for another political exchange. The first Tulip outposts had been prepared for patrol trouble, not a trained force advancing under artillery support. Several defenders were surrounded before signal fires could warn the next position. Greywood's steel and superior numbers ended those fights quickly, and Serena kept the army moving instead of allowing a profitable pause for looting. Tulip's first border outposts were not prepared for the scale of the force. 3 positions fell in rapid succession. Some defenders fought. Others withdrew rather than be surrounded by numbers they had never expected Kevins to assemble. The mercenaries gained confidence from the easy victories, which Serena treated as useful and dangerous at the same time. Winning 3 small outposts could teach soldiers the wrong lesson about a fortified capital. She reminded company leaders that Valerius's main army had not yet been engaged. The march continued deeper into Tulip territory. Villages closed their doors as the column passed, while scouts reported defensive troops concentrating nearer the capital. Valerius finally accepted that the campaign was not a commercial bluff. A bloodied messenger reached his castle with news that 3 border positions had fallen, and the invasion was already within striking distance of the capital. Count's first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by rage that a family he considered socially inferior had crossed into open war. War bells rang across the city. The gates closed, the drawbridge rose, and units that had existed separately on paper began assembling behind the walls. He mobilized the force he had trusted from the beginning. Roughly 200 heavy knights formed the most prestigious part of the defense. 300 elite spearmen gave the line weight against charges. 100 heavy shield troops were assigned to absorb missile pressure and protect vulnerable positions. Another 100 longbowmen provided ranged fire. Around 400 militia filled the remaining gaps. 9 mages strengthened the army, including several first-tier casters, 3 second-tier specialists, and 1 third-tier mage with enough power to influence a local battle directly. On paper, it was the kind of force Southern warfare had taught Valerius to trust. He also had walls, towers, familiar terrain, and defenders who knew what defeat would cost their families. The Kevin's army stopped roughly 800 paces from the main defensive position near the capital. At that distance, ordinary archery could not settle anything. Valerius rode forward far enough to trade insults and demand that the invaders withdraw before he taught highborn dogs the difference between money and noble blood. The mercenary line answered with noise rather than discipline until officers forced it quiet again. Valerius ordered a demonstration from his archers. A volley rose beautifully into the sky and fell hundreds of paces short of the Kevin's front. The arrows buried themselves in empty ground. Serena watched the ranged demonstration and did not need to answer with words. She ordered the 4 Greywood cannons brought forward. 2 were assigned to the main gate. The remaining 2 would target the heavy crossbow positions and the tower supporting Valerius's mages. The refined guns had improved noticeably since Greywood's earlier artillery experiments. Better barrels, powder control, and crew practice had increased practical range and hitting power by roughly 1/3. That improvement had been born from months of boring workshop revisions, rather than one dramatic invention. Now it was about to appear on a battlefield, where nobody on the other side understood what those revisions meant. The cannon crews set their angles while Tulip defenders watched from beyond effective bow range. Valerius still believed he was observing an alchemical trick meant to intimidate him. Serena gave the order to fire. 4 guns answered almost together. The field disappeared behind smoke, and the sound rolled against the walls like a physical impact. One 12-pound ball struck near the main gate's hinges and tore through timber iron fittings, and the guards positioned too close behind it. A second impact ripped more material from the entrance and left the structure visibly failing. Another cannon hit a heavy crossbow emplacement and destroyed both the machine and the crew around it. The final shot smashed into the mage tower, showering stone and debris across the defenders below. For the first time, Valerius's army understood that the distance between the lines belonged to Kevin's rather than to them. The Count still reached for the explanation that preserved his existing worldview. No weapon that destructive could fire often. The ammunition must be rare. The alchemical cost must be enormous. The attackers would exhaust their trick and then face real soldiers on conventional terms. Serena had been counting on that exact conclusion. The first artillery volley did not end the battle. The exchange immediately before it had been almost theatrical. Valerius looked down from armor etched with defensive runes and saw no siege towers or massive catapults in the enemy camp. What he could see were ladders, simple rams, and a large body of people he still classified as purchased rabble. Across roughly 800 paces, the two leaders traded insults instead of terms. Valerius mocked Kevin's as new money smelling of fish and ocean wind. The Kievan side answered that Tulip arrogance had strangled southern trade long enough, and that the battlefield would decide whose rules still mattered. Valerius threatened to use the Southern Council to strip his rivals' commercial rights, even if the army somehow survived. Kevin's answered that councils usually learned to cooperate with whoever controlled the important ports after the killing stopped. The argument ended when Valerius ordered his longbowmen to fire. It destroyed something more important first: the defensive assumptions both armies had carried onto the field. At 800 paces, the opening arrow volley failed almost comically. The shafts rose, lost power, and landed roughly 300 paces short of the Kevin's formation. Serena watched from a low rise through a telescope and ignored the performance. Her artillery instructor was already assigning targets. Guns 1 and 2 would work the reinforced gate. The other pieces would attack the surviving heavy crossbows and the mage tower. Mercenaries who had spent a month hearing Serena promise that firearms would open the way finally saw the promise become physical. The main gate was damaged before a single hired swordsman entered bow range. These were not exactly the same cannons Greywood had used in earlier sieges. Thicker breeches, more consistent black powder, rounder shot, and repeated crew practice had increased practical power and range by roughly 30 to 40%. None of those changes looked revolutionary alone inside a workshop report. Together, they meant the defenders were being hit from a distance. Their existing defenses had never been designed around. The cannon carriages dug visible furrows into the ground under recoil when the battery fired. A heavy crossbow position vanished, without trading one shot with the weapon that destroyed it. Stone fell from the mage tower, while the defenders were still trying to understand the range involved. One iron ball tore apart the gate's steel hinge area and killed guards sheltering behind the entrance. Another smashed a heavy defensive crossbow so violently that broken timber from the weapon wounded the crew around it. The strike on the mage tower ripped granite from the structure and sent pieces into the courtyard below. Men on the wall shouted for emergency materials to reinforce an entrance whose original hardware had already failed. Some defenders were still clutching their ears when officers started demanding a response. The Kevin's line reacted with a roar. Officers used the surge in morale before it could turn into disorder and signaled the first mercenary companies forward. Hundreds of hired fighters started across the open ground. Some carried shields, others spears or swords, and many wore the discounted steel armor Greywood had supplied through Serena's agreement. They did not advance with iron guard precision. They advanced with enough confidence that the formation held together under movement. Behind them, the loyal Kevin's firearm troops maintained their position and watched the rear as planned. The arrangement was ugly but effective. Every mercenary knew retreat without orders would mean running toward armed men who had no financial reason to forgive panic. Forward still offered a battlefield already being softened by artillery. Valerius's officers reacted quickly once the charge began. Valerius himself was still trying to categorize what had happened. The cannons showed no elemental signature his mages could identify. He therefore decided the attackers must possess some extraordinarily expensive alchemical weapon rather than a reproducible mechanical system. That explanation comforted him, because alchemical siege weapons, in his experience, were too costly to fire repeatedly. He ordered the defenses to hold, instead of falling back from the damaged outer positions. Tulip mages gathered near the surviving protected positions and started shaping spells for the distance where the mercenaries would become vulnerable. The third-tier mage did not waste power trying to answer the cannons directly at their extreme range. Instead, the casters waited for the advancing mass to enter a zone where fire and lightning could punish concentration. Longbowmen began preparing another volley. The surviving heavy crossbows were turned toward the densest sections of the charge. Those machines were far more dangerous than the earlier arrows had made the Tulip ranged line look. A heavy bolt could cross the remaining distance, with enough force to punch through shields, armor, and multiple bodies in the same path. The bolts were more than 2 meters long under the surviving reports, closer to narrow spears than ordinary crossbow ammunition. Their winches creaked under the force required to draw them. When they released into the dense charge, the steel did not care that many mercenaries were wearing Greywood armor. Several shots passed through 3 or 4 men before finally stopping. The first successful shots proved it brutally. One enormous shaft drove through the front man and continued into fighters behind him before finally losing momentum. Another tore a gap through a company that had been shouting in triumph only seconds earlier. Men fell. The advance stumbled around them and kept moving. Greywood's steel armor helped against ordinary blades and lighter missiles, but Serena had never promised it could turn a siege crossbow into a harmless inconvenience. The battlefield was now demonstrating exactly where every technology still had limits. A musket could make noble armor less decisive. A cannon could make a gate vulnerable at unfamiliar range. Neither invention removed the fact that a man hit cleanly by a massive crossbow bolt could still die before he reached the wall. Serena watched the casualties without pretending surprise. This was why Laurian had rejected using his own iron guard for the first assault. Even a well-prepared attack on a defended position consumed lives once the distance closed. The proxy strategy had changed whose army absorbed that cost. That truth was cold enough that Serena did not try to dress it in noble language. The Kevin's family wanted Valerius broken. The mercenaries wanted the pay. Greywood wanted Balon and a better southern trade balance. Those motives had brought thousands of people to the same field, without making any of them identical. Tulip's mages released their first coordinated spells as the front ranks entered range. The magical response built visibly above the wall. Fire and lightning elements gathered around the casting positions, while surviving troops below tried to stabilize the broken sections. From the Kevin's side, the glow was bright enough to warn the mercenaries that the defenders had finally reached the range where their own power mattered. The battle was moving from artillery dominance into overlapping kill zones where both systems could cause serious losses. Fire rolled across part of the open ground, while lightning struck among clustered fighters and forced nearby companies to spread. The charge lost some of its earlier noise. Men who had imagined the cannon blast meant an easy victory now remembered that the defenders still possessed their own advantages. Company leaders shouted for spacing. Veterans pulled younger fighters around burning patches instead of letting them bunch behind the first obstacle. The month of drills began paying for itself in small, unglamorous decisions. A camp full of untrained hired blades might have collapsed the first time magic killed several men at once. This force bent, cursed, and continued. Behind the smoke, Greywood's artillery crews were already working through the next loading cycle. Powder had to be measured correctly, even while Front troops advanced downrange. The gun captains watched angles more carefully now, because a small mistake could send iron into the backs of the mercenaries they were supporting. Every second reduced the number of safe targets. The gate remained the clearest one. It had taken serious damage from the first volley, and the defenders around it were trying to clear debris while reinforcing the entrance from inside. Valerius saw men moving through smoke and interpreted the survival of his line as proof that his earlier judgment was still correct. The attackers had possessed a frightening opening trick. Now, in his view, real combat had begun. He ordered the heavy troops to hold their positions and prepare to destroy the mercenaries once they reached close range. His knights had spent years training for exactly that kind of collision. The elite spearmen knew how to receive a charge. Shield troops were already shifting toward damaged sections, where missile pressure was greatest. From inside the logic of conventional southern warfare, the response looked reasonable. The problem was that the battlefield no longer belonged entirely to conventional southern warfare. Every minute Valerius waited for the fight to become familiar gave the cannon crews another chance to make something else unfamiliar disappear. The mercenary front moved closer through arrows, heavy bolts, and spellfire. Casualties accumulated unevenly. One company reached a shallow depression in the field and used it for cover. Another stayed too tightly packed and paid for the mistake when a spell landed among them. The one-eyed swordsman's veterans moved more carefully than the younger groups, using shields and terrain rather than racing for the gate. The one-eyed veteran himself had joined the first surge behind a heavy shield. Men near him were already shouting about Valerius's treasury, as though the money inside the city had personally invited them forward. His caution did not disappear just because greed had won the argument. He kept angling his company away from the most obvious lanes of crossbow fire, while faster groups ran directly through them. Their slower pace looked cowardly from a distance, until another heavy bolt passed through the space they had deliberately abandoned. Professional survival instincts were proving useful after all. Serena kept her attention divided between the assault and the damaged fortifications. The objective was never simply to win an impressive field battle. Pressure had to force Valerius into a position where negotiation, collapse, or loss of control opened access to the prisoners. Destroying every defender was unnecessary if the Count's political position broke first. That distinction mattered because Greywood had no interest in occupying Tulip territory afterward. The Kevin's family could decide what land, concessions, or trade rights it wanted from the conflict. Serena's hidden ledger still carried only 4 names at the top: Balan's steel anvil, his 2 sons, his daughter. As long as they remained alive, the operation still served Laurian's original purpose. No report had yet confirmed their condition since the invasion began. Werewolf scouts could watch roads and movements, but they could not simply walk through a guarded dungeon to check on prisoners. Serena therefore had to keep the larger war moving without revealing why those particular captives mattered. If Valerius recognized their real value, the entire rescue mechanism would become more expensive instantly. The cannons fired again, where the advancing lines left safe angles. Another impact struck the already damaged entrance and broke away more of the structure around it. Defenders close to the gate scattered deeper inside rather than wait for another ball. The sound carried across the field and lifted the mercenary line a second time. Men who had slowed under magic started pushing again, because the wall in front of them was visibly failing. Tulip's officers answered by sending more troops toward the threatened approach. That movement concentrated soldiers exactly where artillery damage and the eventual assault would matter most. The battlefield became a contest between 2 military logics unfolding at once. Valerius trusted trained elites, walls, mages, and the willingness of defenders to hold home ground. Serena trusted money, logistics, hired mass, and machines that attacked the assumptions behind those advantages. Neither side possessed a weapon capable of erasing the other without cost. The modern methods were not magic. They were simply changing which costs arrived first and who had to pay them. A heavy crossbow bolt tore through another cluster of mercenaries. A spell burst near the front and sent burning men rolling across the earth. The surviving fighters stepped around them and continued toward the damaged gate. Behind the charge, cannon crews worked through smoke, while Kevin's musketeers held the rear line and waited for their own range to matter. Valerius remained convinced that the northern weapons would soon exhaust themselves and leave the attackers trapped in an ordinary battle. Serena knew the guns still had powder, the supply wagons were intact, and the army had been built specifically to survive long enough for that belief to become expensive. No one on the field yet knew whether the strategy would break Tulip's defenses or how many people it would cost before the answer became clear. That uncertainty was exactly where Laurian's information stopped. No reliable dispatch had yet established who controlled the field after the initial exchange. The cannons had proven they could damage the fortifications, but the mercenary charge had not completed the assault. Tulip's mages were only beginning to answer, and the remaining heavy crossbows were still killing people in the open ground. Balon and his family remained somewhere inside Valerius's control with no confirmed rescue. For the moment, the only certain result was that Valerius's gate was failing, while his soldiers fought an enemy operating by rules he had dismissed, until the first cannonball arrived.